The tension was thick inside the Hunter Association, as Sillid, the Frost Monarch, sat with eerie ease across from President Go, whose mind scrambled to make sense of the intruder's sudden presence. Something about the creature twisted his instincts, something ancient and wrong. He couldn't understand how he had failed to sense such a dangerous aura. The aura now swelling around the creature made it clear. He was no ordinary intruder. President Go couldn't face this alone. As his mind raced, Sillid's voice, cold and calm, broke through the silence. He informed the chairman that the office had already been severed from the outside world. That declaration rattled President Go. It felt surreal, like a dream slipping into nightmare. But before he could fully grasp that thought, something sharp and fast sliced past his left shoulder. A searing chill followed. He looked down to see frost forming rapidly, a jagged trail of ice spreading across his suit where the projectile had grazed him. Pain bloomed beneath the surface as Sillid, without shifting tone, commented on the wound and wondered aloud if the chairman still believed he was dreaming. Now, fully alert, President Go steadied his voice and demanded to know who the figure was. But Sillid merely frowned at the question, his tone tinged with disappointment as he remarked that he had hoped President Go would recognize him without the need for introductions. Confusion still clouded the chairman's thoughts, but Sillid continued, his words sharp and dismissive. He called President Go a fragment of brilliant light, urging him to reveal his true self. Then, almost mockingly, he added that perhaps the fragment was simply afraid, that the vessel might crumble beneath the weight of its own power. With no reaction from President Go, Sillid seemed to lose interest in conversation. His eyes narrowed, and without hesitation, he unleashed a devastating burst of icy magic. The explosion rippled through the office, shaking the walls and filling the room with a thick white fog that cloaked everything in sight. But in that freezing haze, Sillid smiled as two radiant lights shone through, piercing, golden eyes burning with power. The fragment of brilliant light had finally awakened. Sillid didn't waste a second. Another blast followed, more precise and lethal, aimed straight at the heart. But this time, President Go moved. His arm swung with divine force, deflecting the attack and sending it crashing into the wall. The explosion shattered stone and steel, revealing an endless void beyond. As the fog slowly cleared, President Go stepped forward, his body now cloaked in a luminous golden aura, pulsing with divine energy. This wasn't the Hunter Association chairman anymore. This was the brightest fragment of brilliant light in full form. The Frost Monarch's gaze sharpened. With a grim grin, he admitted that he had searched for this power for a long time, never realizing it had been hiding in what he now called a broken vessel. His tone shifted as he revealed that all 7 fragments of brilliant light had already been located, and that 2 had already been destroyed. His goal now was simple: to witness the proud humiliation on the brightest fragment's face before killing him. The President Go didn't flinch. His roar echoed with defiance, daring the Frost Monarch to prove he could bring him down. Sillid chuckled darkly, amused that a fragment, clinging to a fading body, dared to challenge a monarch who had long since conquered his own vessel. He scoffed at the idea, wondering aloud if President Go could even land a single hit. Then, the monarch raised his arms. With a thunderous screech, a massive wall of jagged ice surged forward like a wave of death. President Go dodged at the last moment. The ice tore through the space he had just occupied, and with clenched fists, he retaliated. A golden punch crashed into the wall of frost, shattering it into frozen shards that rained down like hail. Without missing a beat, he charged and aimed a devastating strike at Sillid, but the monarch danced away effortlessly, countering with a spear of ice that sliced across President Go's shoulder. Blood bloomed. The chairman staggered. Sillid, confident, let his guard slip for a split second, and President Go saw it. He lunged forward, driving a punch toward the opening, but Sillid was too quick. An ice barrier formed in an instant, absorbing the blow. Still, President Go didn't stop. He attacked again and again, pressing forward, trying to find even the smallest weakness. But Silid moved like mist, untouchable, and the chamber rang with the sound of their clash. Magic exploded with every collision, shaking the structure from within. President Go's breaths grew heavier. His movements slowed. His body screamed with every step. He was running out of time. With desperation mounting, he pushed himself into one last charge. A golden punch flashed forward, blazing with everything he had left. But Silid simply stepped back, avoiding the strike with ease. The chairman clenched his teeth in frustration. The truth hit him like a hammer. His vessel was breaking. His strength was nearly gone. Silid stood tall and untouched. His gaze, once curious, now held something colder: pity. The monarch vanished from sight and reappeared an instant later right before him. President Go's eyes barely registered the movement before the spear tore through his chest. Agonizing pain erupted through his body. Blood poured from his mouth as he stumbled, barely remaining upright. Silid loomed over him, grinning, watching the fragment crumble. He spoke calmly, almost amused, wondering how long it would take to find a new vessel. But by the time that happened, he said, the monarchs would already have gathered. This world would fall long before the fragment could return. President Go coughed, blood dripping down his chin, but a laugh still escaped his lips. Low and ragged, he gripped the spear with one hand and spoke through the pain, saying he hadn't fought in vain. The Frost Monarch had missed something. Just as the fragments had failed to anticipate his actions, Silid too overlooked what truly mattered. The monarch's eyes narrowed, sensing something powerful and wrong. Then, without warning, a colossal burst of mana roared past his face. The explosion behind him rocked the dimension itself, shattering part of the enclosed space. Silid turned toward the chairman with a bitter grin, asking if that was the surprise he had been buying time for. But President Go only smiled through the blood, calm and certain. What needed to happen had already begun. A quiet rumble followed, and then a deafening crash. The mana barrier Silid had crafted around the office shattered into pieces, crumbling like glass. Confusion flashed across the monarch's face as he muttered that a broken barrier wouldn't change the outcome. But President Go wasn't done. With the last of his strength, he let out a cry. From beneath him, the shadows shifted, and a figure surged forth. In a blur, an ant-shaped creature darted forward as it wept through the shattered wall with an ear-piercing scream. Silid's gaze snapped to it, momentarily stunned, but he brushed it off as just another foot soldier from the abyss. It didn't matter, or so he believed, until a chilling realization hit him, freezing his expression. This wasn't just any soldier. His eyes widened in horror. He had made a grave mistake. Panic struck as he flung President Go's body aside and launched himself after the ant. A sickle of frost materialized in his hand, ready to strike the creature down before it could escape. He reached it in a flash and swung the blade, but the sickle never connected. A hand caught it midair, fingers closing around the blade with bone-crushing force. The monarch's eyes widened as time seemed to stop. That wasn't the ant anymore. Standing before him, gripping the sickle like it was nothing, was a figure cloaked in shadows. It was Jinwoo. His cold, piercing eyes locked onto the Frost Monarch as he grabbed Silid by the throat, demanding to know his true identity. The Frost Monarch's heart sank as he grasped for breath, but even in this weakened state, he sensed the monstrous shadow army looming behind Jinwoo. His gaze narrowed with sudden wariness. He muttered under his breath, referring to Jinwoo as the Shadow Monarch, then questioned why, even after amassing such a vast army, he hadn't reached out to the other monarchs sooner. Jinwoo's confusion was plain in his eyes, and in that instant, Silid finally understood what President Go had meant during their fight. He realized with growing dread that Jinwoo was the crucial piece he had overlooked. A surge of cold energy rapidly formed in his mouth and with desperation gripping him, Sillid released a devastating blast of freezing air. Jinwoo's instincts kicked in. He shot backward just in time, narrowly avoiding the attack as an enormous ice wall erupted ahead of him. The sheer pressure of the magic confirmed what he already suspected. This being wasn't just a monarch, but a dangerously adept magic user. Without wasting a breath, Jinwoo summoned his demon monarch daggers. The twin blades gleamed with ominous light as he lunged forward, shattering the ice wall with a single, precise strike. But just as he prepared to strike again, Sillid raised his hands, not in defense, but in surrender, and unexpectedly suggested ending the fight. The Frost Monarch claimed he hadn't come to risk his life in a battle to the death. Sillid's cold gaze shifted toward the crumpled form behind Jinwoo. At that moment, realization struck. The chairman. Jinwoo turned his head. Blood-coated President Go's motionless body. The man was barely clinging to life. Then, without a word, Sillid conjured an enormous spear of jagged ice. He launched it straight toward the helpless chairman, presenting Jinwoo with a cruel ultimatum. Jinwoo's eyes blazed as he immediately activated Ruler's authority, his mind screaming for the attack to stop, but a notification interrupted him. The Frost Monarch's magic resisted his command. His fury exploded. Slamming his foot into the ground, Jinwoo shot forward with all his speed, cutting through the air toward President Go. The ice spear shrieked as it neared its target. In one final surge, Jinwoo reached the chairman's side and intercepted the spear mid-flight, deflecting it with a resounding clash of metal and frost. The deadly weapon veered away, embedding itself into a marble pillar. He had saved him, for now. But Jinwoo's rage was now fully ignited, his glare locked onto the Frost Monarch, who stood there, watching with infuriating calm. Before he could retaliate, Sillid summoned a swirling portal behind him and turned to flee. Jinwoo wouldn't let him escape unscathed. He called forth a barrage of daggers from his inventory and hurled them in a deadly flurry. One dagger hit true, sinking deep into Sillid's shoulder. The monarch's body tensed with pain, his expression twisted as he clenched his teeth, fury boiling just beneath the surface. Yet he didn't attack. He stepped toward the gate, declaring coldly that he would return, once Jinwoo's shadows opened again. And with one final venomous taunt, he gestured toward the dying chairman, calling him Jinwoo's parting gift, a corpse soon to join his army. The words pierced deeper than the spear ever could, but before Jinwoo could move again, the monarch vanished into the shrinking portal. The room fell into an unnatural silence. The magical barrier was gone, and Jinwoo cursed himself for not sensing the threat sooner. He turned and rushed to President Go's side. The chairman lay still, his body soaked in blood. Jinwoo knelt beside him, heart racing. This wasn't something a potion could heal. Without hesitation, he called for his most trusted summon. Beru heard the call and tore through space like a bolt of lightning. He dropped to one knee before Jinwoo, awaiting orders. Jinwoo's voice was low, tight with urgency. Beru was to do everything in his power to save him. The loyal summon placed his clawed hands over the chairman's chest and channeled his full magical strength. Healing light surged, but nothing changed. Jinwoo's jaw tightened. From his inventory, he drew a small vial, the holy water of life, the last resort. He leaned forward, ready to administer it, until a trembling hand rose and clutched his wrist. President Go's eyes fluttered open, barely. His voice was hoarse and broken as he whispered for Jinwoo to stop. It was already too late. Jinwoo froze, wanting to resist, to argue, but the look in the chairman's eyes left no room for protest. Labored breath, the chairman offered words of gratitude. Jinwoo had arrived, and that alone was enough. Blood spilled from his lips as he spoke of the Supreme Being, of revelations from the other side, and a battle on the horizon unlike any that had come before. There were things Jinwoo needed to understand, warnings he had to hear. Jinwoo held his breath, trying to memorize every word as the life drained from the man before him. The chairman's hand trembled as he squeezed Jinwoo's, warning that a time would come when he'd have to make a critical choice about which side to stand on, and pleaded with him to stay with humanity, no matter what. President Go's voice cracked as he confessed his longing to fight alongside the younger generation, to protect the world with them. But his body had failed him. Still, he had no regrets. Meeting Jinwoo had given him peace, and as his breath slowed, he spoke one last truth. His heart, weak and faltering, had endured all this time just for this moment, just to see Jinwoo with his own eyes. At last, his hand slipped from Jinwoo's grasp, falling to the floor with a soft, final thud. It was over. Jinwoo remained still, lips pressed in a tight line, eyes fixed on the lifeless face of a man he had respected. Bearer said nothing, head bowed low beside him. And outside, beyond the broken glass, the sky broke open. Rain began to fall, soft, unending, and mournful, as if the heavens themselves had paused to mourn a life now lost. The cold autumn wind whispered through the falling rain as headlines lit up screens across the globe. Brazil's great hunter Jonas had been found lifeless in a river. The chairman of the Korean Hunters Association had been brutally murdered, stabbed through the heart. And just like that, the names of Christopher Reed, Jonas, and Gunhee, once revered as the world's mightiest protectors, were now written among the dead. Panic swept through the nations. News outlets looped grim footage and desperate commentary. Even the U.S. Hunter Association stepped forward with a statement, but no words could soothe the rising dread. Humanity had always looked to hunters for salvation, but now the world was forced to ask the terrifying question, who protects the hunters? The rain poured with no intention of letting up as mourners gathered beneath black umbrellas for President Go's funeral. The sky mourned with them, a heavy downpour that dulled the color from the world. Jinwoo stood still, gaze fixed downward, unmoving. His eyes eventually drifted to the side, where Chief Woo Jinchul stood just a few steps away. The man looked hollowed out, every trace of sharp discipline in his appearance gone. His eyes were sunken with grief, and his shoulders sagged beneath an invisible weight. With a voice choked by loss, Jinchul questioned why it had been impossible to save the chairman, even with all of Jinwoo's power. Jinwoo's response came low, heavy with regret. It had already been too late when he arrived. No further words came. Jinchul lifted his head slightly, letting the rain strike his face as he stared into the gray heavens. Just yesterday, the chairman had asked him about his trip to the U.S., had told him to return quickly. And now, just like that, he was gone, a life snatched away before he could even say goodbye. The chief turned back and thanked Jinwoo for being with the chairman in his final moments, but Jinwoo didn't speak. He couldn't. There was only the cold simmering in his chest, an oath forged in silence. He would find the one responsible, no matter the cost. As the rain intensified, Jinwoo made his decision. He turned toward Jinchul, voice clear beneath the sound of falling water, and instructed him to gather the reporters. It happened fast. The press conference was organized within the hour, and the room quickly swelled with eager voices and flashing cameras. When Jinwoo entered, the chatter died instantly. His presence alone silenced the room. Every lens locked onto him. He spoke plainly, but his words hit with force. There existed now a colony of monsters, intelligent, cunning, and far stronger than anything humanity had seen. These beings didn't attack openly. They isolated their targets, deploying magic that severed space, preventing escape and reinforcement. A reporter, unable to hold back, asked if the creature that had killed President Go was among them. Jinwoo's eyes didn't flinch. He confirmed it. The one responsible was part of that same colony. He continued, issuing a warning to every hunter around the world. Anyone who felt they might be targeted needed to stay close to their comrades. To fight alone was to invite death. But behind his words, Jinwoo's thoughts wandered back to the creature's final words. the name it had given itself, the Monarch of Frost. And if that was true, then there were others, the Monarch of the Beginning, and even Jinwoo himself, the Monarch of the Shadows. These were beings whose strength eclipsed even the greatest hunters alive. No one else could face them. As the silence in the room deepened, Jinwoo closed with one final statement. For those without comrades, for those who felt alone and vulnerable, they should reach out to him through the Korean Hunters Association. He would protect them. The Battle of Monarchs had begun, and the world would never be the same. In a cold, dimly lit cave, deep beneath the earth, the air was thick with unease as 5 monarchs gathered in silence. Their presence warped the space around them, a suffocating pressure building as Silid, the Frost Monarch, finally broke it. The others turned toward him as he spoke with chilling certainty. The Shadow Monarch was alive, and he was walking the surface of Earth. Yogumont, the Transfiguration Monarch, narrowed his eyes, his voice laced with doubt as he muttered that it was impossible. No vessel could contain the true power of the Shadow Monarch. Even the Dragon King couldn't maintain his form on Earth, so how could this be? But Silid's expression didn't waver. He said he'd seen it himself. The Shadow Monarch was alive, real, and more dangerous than the fragment of brilliant light they had once feared. The atmosphere thickened. None of them wanted to believe it, yet none could challenge the certainty in Silid's words. Silid continued, proposing what none had dared to voice. They should attack the Shadow Monarch now, while he was still in human form. It was their only chance. He asked for their support, his voice hardening with resolve. Tarnak, the Monarch of the Iron Body, scoffed and dismissed the idea outright, reminding Silid that picking a fight with one of the strongest among the 9 monarchs wasn't bravery, it was suicide. He urged patience, insisting they wait for the return of the Dragon King, the Monarch of Destruction. Silid's eyes flashed as pain flared through his wounded shoulder, his fists tightening. Waiting wasn't an option. They were monarchs, not servants hiding behind another's strength. If they didn't act now, they never would. The human vessel was a flaw, one that could be exploited. But Tarnak didn't flinch. He reminded them what had happened to the Monarch of White Flames. The Shadow Monarch had bound him with a single command, turning his eternal form into a silent slave. Tarnak refused to suffer the same fate. Yogamont agreed, his tone cool and distant. He didn't want to gamble his existence just to fall like the others. The risk wasn't worth it. Raken, the Monarch of Beasts, growled in frustration, branding them cowards. He refused to believe that even the Shadow Monarch's authority could bend true monarchs in their original forms into his servants. Tarnak turned to Raken, his voice sharp, reminding him that the Shadow Monarch and the Administrator were now working together. That alone made them more dangerous. They didn't need to enslave the monarchs directly, not when they could be replicated, recreated, and used like tools. With no more words, Tarnak opened a dark portal and vanished into the void. Yogamont followed, leaving only 3 behind. Raken narrowed his eyes and faced Silid directly, demanding proof that the Shadow Monarch still retained some trace of humanity. Silid pulled out a dagger, its blade faintly pulsing with a sickly hue. He said it had pierced him during the battle, and it was coated with poison. Ashborn, the true Shadow Monarch, would never have needed such a thing. Queresha, the Monarch of Plagues, tilted her head, her voice low with disdain, as she admitted poison was beneath the Shadow Monarch. If he had truly been in control, he would have crushed Silid with raw power, not resorted to human cowardice. Silid's gaze moved between them. The vessel still had limits, weaknesses. That was their opening. He asked again, would they stand with him? This time, Raken's grin stretched wide, his eyes gleaming with bloodlust. Queresha responded with a slow nod, his wicked smile matching the growing tension. The human vessel piqued their interest, and with that, the 3 monarchs boldly decided to challenge and kill the Shadow Monarch. Meanwhile, above the surface, a somber atmosphere enveloped the city as rain poured relentlessly. Atop a towering skyscraper, Jinwoo stood unmoving, the downpour soaking him, yet his expression remained still as stone. His eyes scanned the city below, sharp and unyielding, trying to trace even the faintest ripple of the Frost Monarch's magic. But it was gone. He recalled the moment Scylla declared himself in his original form, a truth that aligned with what the Monarch of Giants had told him. Monarchs and rulers, in their true states, could not be transformed into shadows. That meant his usual means of tracking, his shadows, were useless now. But as the wind howled around him, Jinwoo's eyes remained firm, glinting with resolve. He didn't need shadows to hunt. As long as he was a hunter, he would not miss his prey. Across the city, deep within the Korean Hunters Association, the boardroom was filled with grim faces. A week had passed since President Gunhee's death, and the chair at the head of the table remained hauntingly empty. The time had come to appoint a successor. One of the senior executives finally broke the silence, remarking that the association had always been led by an S rank, a symbol of strength that kept the great guilds in balance. Without someone of that stature, things could spiral. Another member countered with caution, warning that power alone wasn't enough. Leadership wasn't just about rank. After a long debate, a name was finally offered: Woo Jinchul. His head lifted in disbelief, eyes widening slightly as he asked, almost reflexively, if they were serious. But the board remained firm. They reminded him that no one had worked closer with the late chairman than he had. He had inherited not just President Go's experience, but also his values, and his leadership during countless critical moments had earned him respect throughout the association. Still, Jinchul hesitated, claiming there were others more qualified, older, stronger, more suited. He wasn't an S rank. He wasn't ready. Yet the board was quick to clarify that no law dictated the chairman had to be an S rank. What mattered was trust, and Jinchul had it, not just from them, but from the one man whose influence could shift nations, Song Jinwoo. They didn't pressure him. They merely asked him to consider. And after a long pause, Jinchul finally gave a quiet nod, accepting the weight of the legacy now placed on his shoulders. At the same time, far across the ocean, deep within the Scavenger Guild's headquarters, Thomas Andre walked alongside Laura as they made their way down into the guild's secured lower levels. His voice echoed lightly off the stone walls as he muttered that it had been ages since he last visited this place. The guards at the entrance to the vault snapped to attention, startled by his presence, but Thomas gave a grin and waved them off, telling them to relax. He was here for something important. He placed his thumb on the scanner, and with a low mechanical hum, the doors parted to reveal the vault. Laura followed him inside, glancing around with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Her voice was quiet, almost uncertain, as she asked if he truly intended to give away what was stored here. Thomas didn't look back as he answered with calm certainty, saying that after what Jinwoo did for him, and for the guild, it was the least he could do. Inside the room, an eerie energy pulsed in the air as they approached a sealed display case. The overhead lights flickered slightly as the two of them stepped closer, and Laura noted softly that there were only 2 such daggers in the entire world. Their rarity wasn't just legendary, it was historic. But Thomas, without a hint of hesitation, remarked that such weapons weren't meant to sleep in glass coffins, they were forged to be used. As the light caught the glass, the blades inside shimmered. Twin daggers, gray-hilted with crimson edges that pulsed like living blood, rested within, humming with restrained power, as though awaiting a hand strong enough to unleash them. In Korea, a crowd had gathered outside the Ajin Guild's office. Whispers rippled through the people as disbelief spread like wildfire. Thomas Andre, the world's strongest hunter, was inside the modest guild's building. It felt surreal, like something out of a dream. Inside, Jinho sat stiffly, struggling to maintain composure before the towering figure of the Goliath himself. His forced smile barely masked the tension, and sweat clung to his forehead. The other staff weren't faring any better, unable to process the fact that Thomas Andre had walked into their office like it was routine. The air was heavy, not just from Thomas's presence, but also because Leonard Neerman, the top hunter from Germany, was there as well. 2 hours had passed since their arrival, yet Jinwoo remained absent. Jinho, doing his best to seem composed, offered a weak smile as he dialed once more, silently pleading for his boss to answer. Leonard sat in silence, his expression unreadable, though a faint edge of frustration peeked through. He wondered whether he'd even get the chance to meet Jinwoo today, especially with Thomas already waiting. Nearby, Laura translated with calm precision as her boss speculated whether Jinwoo was caught in a raid somewhere, noting how it didn't seem like the man came to the office much. Jinho nodded uneasily, confirming her suspicions while racking his brain over where Jinwoo might be. Then the office doors slid open with a quiet hiss, and Jinwoo stepped in. His presence instantly washed relief across the staff. Jinho leapt up, nearly stumbling as he hurried to his boss. He questioned why Jinwoo hadn't answered his calls, his voice tinged with desperation. Jinwoo, still composed despite his disheveled appearance, replied simply that the recent wave of gate outbreaks had kept him busy. While they spoke, Thomas rose from his seat and approached with the easy confidence of a man who'd never been second to anyone. He greeted Jinwoo casually, and the room fell into a nervous silence. Jinho, standing close, felt the shift in the air and couldn't help but worry whether the two would clash right there in the office. Jinwoo, curious, asked what brought Thomas to Korea. Thomas smiled and reminded him of their agreement to share a meal once his arm had healed, but that wasn't all. He added that he'd brought something for Jinwoo, a rare gift. Jinwoo's brow arched, surprised by the mention of a gift. Thomas suggested they move somewhere private. What he had in hand wasn't something to be handed over in a public office. Jinho overheard and grew suspicious, his gut twisting with concern. What if it was a trap? Jinwoo, however, shifted his attention toward the other hunter in the room. Leonard stepped forward and introduced himself respectfully. Jinwoo immediately assumed that Leonard was there to request some kind of protection commission. But before he could inquire further, Thomas stepped between them and insisted Jinwoo come with him, subtly making it clear this matter held priority. Leonard's patience finally snapped. He argued that after waiting over 2 hours, he deserved to be part of the conversation. But one glare from Thomas silenced him. The message was clear. The upcoming discussion was confidential, and Leonard had no place in it. Inside, Leonard simmered with frustration. He wasn't used to being pushed aside, especially not like this. But there was nothing he could do. The difference in strength was undeniable as he watched Jinwoo walk away with the American hunter. Not long after, the two sat across from each other at a quiet dinner table, joined by their respective associates. Thomas wasted no time. A snap of his fingers summoned his bodyguards, who stepped forward with a briefcase. He made it clear this was a token of gratitude for sparing the wives of his guild members during their last encounter. The briefcase opened with a soft clack, revealing 2 deadly daggers embedded into a giant scale. Jinwoo's eyes locked onto them, instantly recognizing the material. The look on his face said it all. The weapon had been crafted from Kamish's remains. Thomas, impressed by the swift recognition, confirmed it. Jinwoo, still processing, questioned it aloud. Wasn't Kamish's corpse under strict guard by the Hunters Bureau? Thomas explained that while the U.S. government held most of Kamish's remains, he had kept something for himself. During their battle, he had pulled out the dragon's largest canine tooth and kept it as a souvenir. With that same easy grin, he added that he'd eventually had the tooth crafted into a pair of daggers. They were too short to make swords, but perfect as dual weapons. At the time, he hadn't known how useful they'd become, But now he believed they had found their purpose. Jinwoo reached down and pulled one of the daggers from the case. The weight of it, the raw pressure radiating from the blade, it was overwhelming. A prompt flickered into view, revealing the weapon's name, Kamish's Wrath, boasting a staggering attack power of over 1,500. He stood still, momentarily stunned. Nothing he had wielded before came close. The Demon King's daggers seemed like toys in comparison. With a few light swings, Jinwoo realized these weren't ordinary daggers. It felt like wielding a broadsword in each hand. Across from him, Thomas raised a brow and half joked, cautioning Jinwoo that even with his insane durability, those blades could probably pierce him without much effort. He nervously asked if Jinwoo planned to test them on him. Jinwoo calmed his grip and lowered the weapon. The dark crimson aura around the blade faded as if the weapon recognized its new master. The room grew still, the energy lingering like a storm about to break. Thomas turned back to Jinwoo and asked with a faint smile how he liked the gift. Jinwoo remained quiet for a moment before questioning whether he could really accept such a powerful item without offering anything in return. Thomas didn't hesitate. To him, the daggers were a small price to repay what Jinwoo had done. Jinwoo finally nodded and expressed his gratitude, carefully placing the blade back. The satisfaction in his eyes brought a rare joy to Thomas, who leaned back with a sense of contentment, but it didn't last long. Suddenly, both hunters froze. Their senses flared in alarm, a surge of danger impossible to ignore. Thomas turned to Jinwoo, his voice low and tense, as he asked if he had felt it too. Jinwoo gave a brief nod before both bolted to the nearest window. Outside, the city of Seoul had ground to a halt. Cars stopped in the streets. People stood frozen, staring upward with pale, lifeless expressions. The sky had changed. It wasn't just the pressure, it was something deeper. Jinwoo's mind raced as he saw it, the massive magical presence they had felt. This was its true form. Beside him, Thomas muttered under his breath. It was the largest gate he had ever seen, even dwarfing the one Kamish had emerged from. His disbelief echoed the thoughts rushing through his head. Logic had just been torn apart. Reality itself felt like it was unraveling. Something unimaginable was coming. On the ground, stunned onlookers began snapping pictures with their phones, trying to capture the surreal moment. Reporters had gathered too, broadcasting updates with urgency in their voices. They emphasized the unprecedented magnitude of the gate. It was the largest ever recorded since the appearance of magical beasts. Elsewhere in the world, Dr. Belzer, who had long warned about the growing mass of magical energy gathering above the skies, addressed the rising global concern. To him, the gate in Korea wasn't an isolated incident. It was a harbinger. He predicted that such colossal gates could soon begin appearing across other nations as well. When a reporter asked what the wisest course of action might be in response to the event, Dr. Belzer, despite all his expertise in magical beasts and gate phenomena, gave a bleak response. All he could offer was a grim plea to pray, hoping the situation wouldn't spiral into disaster. Meanwhile, Jinwoo soared through the skies on Kaisel, heading straight for the massive gate looming over the city. As Kaisel glided beneath it, Jinwoo scanned the sky above, taking in the sheer size and presence of the anomaly. But as he drew closer, something unexpected happened. He couldn't pass through. An invisible wall blocked his advance, halting him mid-air. No matter how much he pushed, the barrier didn't budge. Jinwoo narrowed his eyes, analyzing the invisible force. This wasn't ordinary. It wasn't a barrier that even the most powerful awakened hunters could break. His thoughts churned with growing unease. If this gate truly held creatures more dangerous than anything they had faced before, then his friends, his family, everyone he cared about, were in danger. A vibration in his pocket snapped him back to the moment. His phone buzzed with the call he had been waiting for. Woo Jin-chul, the new chairman of the Korean Hunters Association, was on the line. calling to share the findings from the Hunter Bureau. The Bureau had finished its scans using satellite tech. Every inch of the planet had been surveyed, but there were no signs of other gates. This massive anomaly above Seoul was the only one. Jinwoo's mind spiraled through the implications. For 3 hours since the gate's sudden appearance, the world had remained eerily quiet. Not a single new gate had opened elsewhere. That couldn't be coincidence. Something larger was unfolding, something orchestrated. Jinchul then informed him that authorities were now moving to evacuate civilians living near the gate, bracing for the worst. He asked Jinwoo directly what his next move would be. Jinwoo didn't hesitate. With firm resolve, he made it clear that no matter what came through that gate, he would stand his ground and face it. Ending the call, he slipped the phone away and turned his gaze upward once more. The gate loomed silently, motionless and menacing. Later that day, Jinwoo stepped into the Hunter Association's gymnasium, the space already prepared for what was to be an intense sparring session. Without hesitation, Baru surged forward, moving at lightning speed, his limbs a blur as he struck. Yet Jinwoo, calm and focused, dodged every attack with ease. Baru lunged again, his mandibles wide in a fierce attempt to land a blow, but Jinwoo intercepted the strike mid-air, catching the mandibles in one hand. For a moment, Baru froze, his compound eyes blinking in stunned silence. He hadn't expected his king's power to outmatch his own this overwhelmingly. Jinwoo looked at him calmly, wondering aloud if Baru was truly giving his all. The words stung, and Baru immediately dropped to one knee, asking forgiveness. But Jinwoo reassured him it was just a warm-up and admitted that Baru was the only one capable of giving him a real challenge anymore. The affirmation filled Baru with a deep, reverent emotion, and he bowed his head even lower, declaring his loyalty with all sincerity. Jinwoo, slightly embarrassed by the theatrics, chuckled and teased him about how expressive he had become lately. Then, shaking off the moment, Jinwoo took his stance again and focused, signaling with a nod that it was time to continue. Baru, already maxed out at commander rank, let out a sharp screech and launched into the air, wings buzzing with energy. He came down like a missile, slashing with deadly precision, but Jinwoo dodged without flinching. Each of Baru's strikes whistled through empty space as Jinwoo remained a phantom just out of reach. When Baru launched a left hook, Jinwoo raised an elbow and blocked it effortlessly. Acknowledging the improvement, Jinwoo noted how much stronger Baru had become since evolving to commander rank. Their sparring grew fiercer. Baru's pace quickened, his strikes harder, more desperate. But no matter how relentless the assault, Jinwoo danced through it all, using the session to test both Baru's evolution and his own current limits. Then came Jinwoo's counterattack. A powerful left hook struck Baru square in the chest, sending the ant staggering backwards. Jinwoo reminded him, coolly but firmly, that there could only be one commander in the army. With Igris and greed steadily closing in on the general rank, it wouldn't be long before they challenged him for that title. Baru's eyes flared at the thought, his pride suddenly on fire. He let out a guttural roar, the sound echoing across the gym as he threw himself back into the match with renewed fury, determined to prove he was still worthy. Jinwoo, watching every move, came to a quiet realization. Even though Baru remained the strongest in his army, he still wasn't strong enough to face the threats that might soon emerge. The sparring session neared its end as Jinwoo delivered a final blow, sending Baru flying across the gym. The summon crashed into the far wall with a thud that shook the room. Slumped against the cracked surface, Baru raised his head slowly, awestruck, and once again acknowledged the vast power of his king. Jinwoo chuckled at the melodrama, shaking his head as he teased Baru about needing to start blocking historical drama channels. Baru, flustered and saddened by the thought, looked up at him with pleading eyes, silently begging him not to take them away. With the sparring over, Jinwoo glanced around the gymnasium and let out a quiet sigh. The place was wrecked. Pulling out his phone, he called the chairman, casually explaining the situation and offering to have his shadow soldiers handle the repairs. On the other side of the city, in a high-rise hotel in Seoul, Thomas Andre stood by the window as he gazed at the colossal gate looming over the skyline. Its eerie presence dominated the heavens, casting a shadow that reached even here. Beside him, Laura, his ever-loyal assistant, stood quietly. She couldn't help but wonder why, with evacuation protocols already in motion and international flights grounded, Thomas had chosen to remain. Thomas simply said he was drawn to the power emanating from that gate. There was no fear in him, only a deep, primal intrigue. Something about the unknown beyond that rift called to him. It wasn't something he could control, nor something he could claim, and that made it all the more irresistible. For Thomas, there was no reason to turn back now. Laura, however, reminded him that the Hunters Bureau was growing increasingly anxious. They feared what might come through, what horrors this gate could release upon the world. But Thomas merely let out a soft chuckle, swirling the wine in his glass as he confidently claimed there was no safer place in the universe than by Jinwoo's side. Yet beneath the bravado, Thomas knew the truth. If they couldn't stop whatever was about to emerge from that gate, then there would be nothing left beyond it. Somewhere deep inside, he wondered whether this would mark the end of humanity or the beginning of something entirely new. In the heart of Seoul, the streets pulsed with tension as honking cars and hurried footsteps echoed off the buildings. Evacuation orders were in full swing, and the Hunter Association directed the chaos, herding civilians to safety. Above it all, perched atop a high-rise, Jinwoo sat alone in silence, his eyes fixed on the dark gate growing ever more unstable in the sky. Too many lives were at stake, and though he had faced countless threats before, this time it felt heavier than ever. Snapping out of his thoughts, he pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts, quietly wondering who he'd want to spend his final moments with, if this battle truly became his last. Elsewhere, inside a quiet dojo, the rhythmic clash of wooden blades rang through the air. Hae-In moved with practiced grace, fully immersed in her training, but the moment her phone buzzed against the wall, her movements faltered. She reached for it, glanced at the screen, and answered. Whatever was said in those few moments made her brow shift ever so slightly. She turned toward her master, requesting to leave. Something urgent had come up. With a silent bow and the master's nod, she walked away, a quiet resolve beginning to form in her chest. Not long after, in a seemingly out-of-place corner of the city, the amusement park was buzzing with life. Amid this fragile peace, a ripple spread through the crowd. Sharp eyes had spotted Jinwoo and Hae-In walking side by side, their casual pace drawing whispers. Some gasped softly, murmuring excitedly about a possible date between the famed S-rank hunters. Jinwoo scanned the area, surprised to see how many people still filled the park, despite the danger hanging overhead. Beside him, Hae-In kept her gaze low, her cheeks tinged red as she spoke quietly, wondering aloud if he liked places like this. Jinwoo answered in his usual calm tone that he didn't particularly enjoy them, but there had always been a part of him that wanted to experience it at least once. Hae-In looked at him, slightly puzzled, asking why he would come somewhere just out of curiosity. With a faint smile, Jinwoo told her that she was his only friend. Her steps faltered for a moment, the warmth in his words catching her off guard. Then he brought up their past, mentioning the battle against the architect. Hae-In flushed immediately, remembering what she had said then, not realizing he'd been conscious enough to hear. Jinwoo teased her gently, saying he had pretty good hearing. Hae-In muttered something under her breath and looked away, still embarrassed. But her curiosity hadn't faded. She asked about the mystery of that dungeon, her tone laced with hesitation. Jinwoo's gaze lingered on the crowd for a moment, before telling her it wasn't something he could explain just yet. He needed more time to process it himself. Hae-In nodded, quietly accepting his answer. Her attention drifted again, this time to the shadows positioned strategically throughout the park. Jinwoo's elite soldiers stood like statues, forming an invisible wall around them. She asked softly if it might attract too much attention. He replied with an ease that it was fine. As she relaxed into the moment, Hae-In realized how long it had been since she felt this light. No responsibilities, no monsters, just walking. With Jinwoo beside her, the pressure she always carried seemed to slip away. There was something different about his presence. It wasn't just comforting, it grounded her. Jinwoo's eyes, however, wandered across the attractions. He asked if Hae-In wanted to try a ride, and she responded a bit too eagerly. Every time he offered a suggestion, she nodded with a smile. Jinwoo soon realized she might have always wanted to come to a place like this too. That decided it. If Hae-In wanted to try everything, then they'd try everything. Their first stop was the roller coaster, but neither of them flinched. Then came the drop tower. Again, no real reaction. The haunted house was next. Ghosts jumped from every corner, but after a few failed attempts to startle them, even the ghosts looked confused, doubting their own effectiveness. Eventually, they settled down on a bench, snacks in hand. Hae-In took a sip from her drink, while Jinwoo asked if she was enjoying herself. She nodded and said she was, but something in her voice wasn't convincing enough. Jinwoo leaned back slightly, noting aloud that the rides weren't exactly thrilling. Hae-In hesitated before admitting that he was right. He smirked and asked if she wanted to try something more fun. She blinked, not quite sure what he meant, until the world dropped away beneath them and the sky opened up. Kaizel soared high above the clouds, wings slicing through the wind with effortless grace. Hae-In's hair whipped around her face as she held on, overwhelmed by the sheer exhilaration. The height, the speed, it was everything the rides hadn't been. The wind softened, turning warm and golden as the sun dipped toward the horizon. The sky stretched endlessly, painted in orange and amber. Hae-In turned to Jinwoo, asking quietly why he would go to an amusement park when he could simply do this. His voice was gentler now, as he said the park had been built over the gate where his father disappeared. He had always wanted to visit the place, just once. Hae-In didn't respond with words. Instead, she leaned closer and wrapped her arms around Jinwoo, a soft embrace filled with gratitude. He didn't move, letting the silence speak for them. After a while, Jinwoo mentioned there was still something he wanted to show her. Kaizel flew farther, across vast landscapes until they arrived in a secluded forest, untouched and endless. As they landed, Hae-In took in the sight, an endless stretch of trees, still and pure. Sitting beside Jinwoo, she smiled quietly and rested her head on his shoulder. The two of them lay quietly intertwined, bathed in the soft glow of starlight, as the serene stillness of the night enveloped them. When morning came, sunlight spilled across the forest, glinting off a waterfall nearby. Hae-In knelt down to drink from the cool stream, while Jinwoo stepped out from between the trees, wearing his overcoat. He told her there was a hotel not far from here, and that they should head there, grab a meal, and clean up. She agreed immediately. A moment later, Kaizel soared into the sky once again, carrying them both toward the horizon. Outside the Korean Hunter Association, the atmosphere buzzed with unease. A middle-aged hunter stepped out of the headquarters. He had just been promoted to B rank, a milestone that filled him with quiet pride. As he strolled down the street, lost in thoughts of celebration, a figure brushed past him, hard enough to jolt him out of his reverie. He spun around, irritation flashing across his face, ready to bark at whoever had bumped him. But the words caught in his throat. Looming before him was a massive figure cloaked in a wild, monstrous aura. The man's breath caught in his throat as his eyes met those of the beast monarch, though he didn't yet realize who or what he was facing. A stunned crowd began to form, whispers crackling through the tension like sparks. But the hunter, still emboldened by his recent achievement, refused to back down. His voice rose with forced confidence, demanding that the beast watch where he was going, demanding an apology for the shove. Raken didn't respond with words. His jaw stretched open wide, revealing rows of jagged shark-like teeth, and his glowing red eyes locked onto the hunter. A beat later, the air was filled with the sickening crunch of bone and the squelch of tearing flesh. In a flash, the B-rank hunter was gone, devoured whole, his blood splattering across the pavement. Fear gripped the souls of the surrounding hunters as chaos erupted all around them. Raken's grin deepened, lips stained crimson as he basked in the terror. Without hesitation, he lunged forward, hurling cars into the air like pebbles, each impact scattering metal and fire across the street. One hunter barely had time to turn before a flying vehicle crushed him. A roar tore from Raken's throat, loud, guttural, and laced with primal fury. The monstrous sound rolled across the city like thunder. His voice, though spoken in the tongue of beasts, carried a message as clear as death. He declared the hunt had begun and vowed to tear through flesh and bone, devouring all who dared stand in his way. The Beast Monarch challenged anyone, if they had the courage, to step forward and try to stop him. Back at the association, Chairman Wu Jinchul shot to his feet as the news hit. His voice cracked with disbelief as he demanded a situation report. The associate, pale and sweating, stammered that the number of casualties was still unknown. Whatever this thing was, it hadn't stopped since it appeared. Time was running out. Frustration surged through Jinchul as he grappled with the escalating crisis. His thoughts were already consumed by the impending dungeon disaster, and now this beast had appeared out of nowhere. His voice hardened as he urgently asked about Jinwoo's whereabouts, but the associate reported that no one had been able to reach him. Gritting his teeth, Jinchul moved toward the door, fully prepared to face the beast himself if he had to. But before he could leave, an employee rushed in, panting and breathless. Someone had appeared, a hunter capable of matching the beast's strength. Jinchul's heart skipped a beat as he asked if Jinwoo had arrived, but the employee shook his head and clarified. It wasn't Jinwoo, but a world-class hunter who just happened to be nearby. Outside, Wenner Nierman stood face-to-face with the nightmare that had descended on Seoul. Germany's strongest hunter could feel the ground trembling with each step Raken took. The stench of blood coated the air, and a creeping doubt tried to worm its way into his thoughts. Leonard steeled himself, tightening his jaw, readying for the battle ahead. But just as he prepared to move toward the monster, Thomas Andre approached from behind, his towering form exuding power as his eyes locked onto the beast monarch. He told Leonard plainly to step back. This wasn't his fight, and if he didn't move, he'd just get in the way. Meanwhile, far from the chaos of Seoul, the morning sun warmed a peaceful countryside. Inside a quiet restaurant, the soft clatter of plates and the scent of fresh breakfast filled the air. Jinwoo sat calmly at a corner table until his phone began to vibrate relentlessly. He answered with a brief greeting, only to hear Chairman Jinchul's voice on the other end, strained and panicked, as he explained that a monster had appeared out of nowhere and was tearing through the city with terrifying force. Jinwoo's expression darkened as he asked how that could be possible, reminding him that the dungeon break wasn't due for days, but Jinchul confirmed the truth. This creature hadn't come from the gate. It was a lone monster, and it had already wiped out an entire guild. This wasn't something they were prepared for. Jinwoo's mind raced. He had stationed shadow soldiers across Seoul to report anything suspicious, and yet there had been no warning. He reached out through the wink, but felt only silence. The connection was faint, the voices of his shadows distant and muted, like whispers through a wall. Even the summoning coordinates for shadow exchange had vanished. Something was blocking them, something powerful and deliberate. Jinwoo's thoughts darkened as he asked the one question that could confirm his fear. Did the monster have a shadow? There was a short pause on the line before Jinchul confirmed that it didn't. The creature had cloaked itself completely, even from Jinwoo's reach. Back in Seoul, Leonard watched as Thomas Andre strode confidently toward the beast. Nearby hunters stood in awe as the Goliath stepped onto the battlefield, squaring up against Raken. Sensing the urgency, Thomas ordered them to start evacuating civilians, then turned his full focus to the enemy before him. The monarch's twisted grin widened as he recognized the threat in front of him, and without hesitation, he lunged. His massive claws slashed forward with terrifying speed, raking across Thomas's chest, but the blow barely slowed him down. Thomas's muscles coiled as he retaliated with a bone-crushing punch that sent Raken's head whipping to the side. Dust exploded from the cracked ground as Thomas pressed in, another devastating blow falling without pause, yet Raken's expression didn't waver. If anything, the beast seemed thrilled. Without wasting another second, Thomas grabbed the monarch by the head and slammed him into the street, the impact shaking nearby buildings and sending rubble flying. As the clash between the two titans raged, Choi Jong-in arrived at the scene, stepping out of his vehicle with urgency etched across his face. His eyes scanned the chaos before him as he asked for a status update on the evacuation. A subordinate quickly approached and reported that the process was still ongoing. Hunters from various guilds, including the Fiend Guild and the White Tiger Guild, were doing everything they could to clear civilians from the area. But Jong-in's attention had already shifted. He could feel it, an oppressive pressure in the air that twisted his gut. The sheer presence of the magic beast ahead was unlike anything he had felt before. Not even the Jeju Island raid had carried this kind of overwhelming dread. Something about it was wrong. Watching from afar, he narrowed his eyes at the distant battle tearing through the city and wondered what kind of monster Thomas Andre had engaged. In the heart of the destruction, Thomas didn't let up. His full-powered fist crashed against the beast monarch's jaw, sending the creature hurtling backward, carving a deep scar through the asphalt before slamming into a building. The concrete structure cracked under the force, yet even that wasn't enough to bring the monster down. Without even a second to breathe, Raken emerged from the dust with terrifying speed. His monstrous form blitzed forward, and in an instant, his skull rammed into Thomas's torso with brutal momentum. But the Goliath didn't budge. Bracing himself, Thomas dug his foot into the ground, absorbing the impact like a stone wall, then wrapped his arms around Raken's waist. With a roar of exertion, he hurled the beast into the air and slammed him down in a crushing suplex. The impact of the attack shattered the earth around them. Yet even that wasn't enough to end it. Raken retaliated in a blur, delivering a powerful kick that slammed into Thomas's jaw with monstrous force. The blow launched Thomas into the air like a missile as debris trailed violently in his wake. Landing lightly, Raken stood tall and grinning, blood matting the fur on his jaw as he basked in the fleeting edge he'd gained. But Thomas wasn't fazed. He landed on his feet a moment later, staring down the beast monarch, and with a determined look, activated his reinforcement skill. The White Tiger Guild arrived at the subjugation site, led by Baek Yunho. As they prepared to join the containment efforts, something massive crashed into the ground nearby, sending a shockwave rippling through the street. Beck staggered slightly, his gaze locking on the cloud of dust, and from it, the monstrous form of Raken emerged, radiating a menacing energy so thick it felt like a storm pressing down on his chest. Beck's breath caught. That kind of mana. It was suffocating, far beyond anything he had ever encountered. His eyes darted across the battlefield until they landed on another colossal figure. Thomas Andre, cloaked in his full armor, standing tall and unyielding. The scale of the clash unfolding before him left Beck speechless. He had seen powerful beings before, but this was something else entirely. Thomas caught sight of Beck's team and barked out a warning, motioning for them to take cover. The battle ahead wasn't something they could interfere with. Raken's bloodlust thickened the air, his jaws stretched open, hunger burning in his crimson eyes as he prepared to charge again. Beck instinctively began to shift into his beast form, sensing the gravity of the threat. But before he could fully transform, Raken was suddenly in front of him. Beck froze. His body refused to move, instincts screaming at him to stay still, to hide, to survive. The beast in him knew better than to challenge the apex predator standing inches away. His knees trembled, his transformation reversed on its own as he reverted to human form, unable to meet Raken's eyes. But Raken didn't care. He merely passed by, uninterested, fixated on his true prey. Then the ground itself seemed to rebel as Raken extended his claws, lifting debris and vehicles into the air as if gravity had abandoned the area. With a casual flick, he sent the wreckage hurtling toward Thomas like missiles, but Thomas didn't flinch. He batted each projectile aside effortlessly, advancing step by step toward the beast monarch. Then Thomas raised his hand, and the battlefield warped around him. His gravitational field expanded outward, pulling everything into his center, including Raken. The beast monarch tried to resist, but the pull was relentless. In one swift motion, Thomas yanked the beast toward him, raised both fists, and slammed them down onto Raken's back with the force of a collapsing mountain. The impact tore a crater into the street, but Thomas wasn't finished. He lunged forward, fists hammering down with machine-like precision, each blow cracking bone and shaking the earth. Blood sprayed, the concrete shattered, and still, Thomas struck. But something felt wrong. Even as he overwhelmed his opponent, a cold unease crept up his spine. It didn't make sense. He was winning, yet the feeling of victory was absent. There was no fear in the monster's eyes, no desperation, only anticipation. He raised his fist one last time, preparing to end it, when suddenly Raken caught it, effortlessly. Thomas's eyes widened. The beast monarch stood, his form now shifting, bones snapping and reshaping as a coat of white fur enveloped him. Raken chuckled darkly, amused that a mere puppet of a fragment had pushed him this far. But he was done playing. In the blink of an eye, his claws slashed forward, faster than Thomas could track. The sound of tearing armor echoed as Thomas struggled to stay upright, parrying with everything he had. But the assault didn't stop. Raken grabbed him by the throat, his grin widening as he mocked Thomas with a twisted invitation, a contest of strength. He crushed Thomas's armor in his grip, but the moment it cracked apart, Raken blinked in surprise. Thomas was gone. Before he could react, arms coiled around his neck from behind. Thomas had slipped past him, locking in a chokehold with brute force. Thomas clenched his teeth, tightening the hold with everything he had, trying to bring the monster down. But Raken didn't panic. He let out a bone-chilling growl as his head twisted unnaturally, rotating 180 degrees with a sickening snap. Thomas barely had time to react before the beast broke free, spun around, and seized him by the face. Raken whiffed at him like a doll, then slammed him into the ground with a thunderous crash. The pavement split apart beneath them. The beast monarch then climbed onto the fallen Thomas, his iron grip still clutching his face as he leaned in, voice dripping with hunger. He was ready to devour Thomas whole. But before he could strike, a beam of magic tore through the air, crashing into Raken's face and sending him tumbling back. He skidded across the battlefield as the momentum dragged him away from his prey. Raken rose with a snarl, eyes burning, and turned to face the source of the attack. Wenner Neerman stood firm beside the fallen Thomas, mana swirling around him, his stance unwavering despite the overwhelming threat before him. Wenner's heart pounded in his chest, his breath shallow as the beast monarch turned toward him, eyes burning with murderous rage. A chill ran down his spine. Thomas, still conscious beneath him, recognized the danger and, with a weak breath, told him to run, urging him to leave before death claimed them both. But Leonard shook his head, trembling, refusing to abandon him. He stood his ground, knees shaking, teeth clenched. He told himself he had no regrets. He had made his choice. But as the monstrous figure drew closer, with each thunderous step, that resolve began to crack. The sheer weight of Raken's presence bore down on him like a mountain. The German hunter's limbs locked in place. He had made the wrong choice. That much became clear as Raken lunged forward, jaws wide open, aiming to end him in a single brutal instant. But then a violent gust tore past Leonard, followed by the crash of something colliding hard against flesh and bone. His eyes shot open. Raken, just moments from devouring him, was now clamped between the massive jaws of Kaizel. The shadow dragon had descended from the sky and dragged the beast monarch away with explosive force, yanking him off course mid-lunge. Raken, suspended midair, twisted violently within Kaizel's grip. A series of wild slashes tore through the dragon's muzzle, and in a flash of dark mist, Kaizel's form vanished into nothingness. Raken dropped back to the earth, unharmed and still grinning, fangs bared in savage delight. But then, the shadows swirled. From above, something descended with blinding speed. In a sudden blur, Jinwoo appeared out of thin air. With flawless control, he twisted mid-fall and struck Raken clean across the skull with a devastating leg kick. The impact thundered across the battlefield, sending the beast monarch crashing into the ground below, shattering concrete and rupturing the earth from the force of the blow. Jinwoo landed beside Leonard, calm and precise, and without wasting a second, instructed him to get Thomas to safety. Leonard snapped out of his daze, nodded sharply, and immediately helped the injured Goliath to his feet, dragging him away as fast as he could. Raken was already rising from the rubble, his massive form unshaken, eyes now locked onto Jinwoo with cold fury. The beast monarch stared at him, something flickering behind his glare, a recognition. He could sense it now, unmistakably. The Shadow Monarch's power coursed through the man in front of him. Rage twisted Raken's expression. Jinwoo could feel the intense killing intent radiating from Raken, but something else tugged at his senses. There was more than one threat here. From the other side of the battlefield, a familiar frost-bitten chill began creeping in. Ice crackled across the ground as the Frost Monarch emerged beside Raken. His voice was venomous, his words laced with contempt as he spoke of Shadow Monarch's arrangement with the administrator, suggesting that Jinwoo's power wasn't born of chance, but carefully orchestrated. The air thickened. Then, from below, a sickening chorus of buzzing filled the silence. Thousands of insects poured from sewer grates, swarming together in a chaotic cloud. They twisted, merged, and formed into a slender, yet menacing figure. The queen of insects had arrived. Kurasha's piercing gaze locked onto Jinwoo, her tone curious and hungry as she mused aloud how it might feel to devour a fellow monarch. Jinwoo's expression turned cold. The battlefield had shifted. He wasn't facing a lone threat anymore, but three monarchs, each radiating ancient, world-ending power. System notifications flickered into his vision like alarm bells, identifying the Frost Monarch, the Beast Monarch, and the Plague Monarch as his sworn enemies. Both ends of the battlefield were blocked. There was no escape, but Jinwoo didn't waver. With a chilling calm, he gave a single command, and the earth beneath him cracked open. From the growing darkness at his feet, the Shadow Army rose in full force. Soldiers poured forth in thousands, covering the land like an unholy tide. At the front, Igris and Iron surged ahead, charging directly at the Frost Monarch with synchronized fury. On the opposite flank, Tank let out a feral roar as he and Jimma lunged toward Raken, eager to tear into the Beast Monarch. Meanwhile, Beru and Greed moved with lethal grace, racing toward the Plague Monarch without hesitation. Raken growled with amusement as he observed the new Shadow Monarch's army. Scyllid, however, remained unfazed. He took a slow, deep breath and released a bone-chilling wind that swept across the battlefield. Sensing the incoming threat, Jinwoo raised his daggers, blocking the icy storm rushing toward him. But his summons weren't so lucky. They failed to react in time. The Shadow Army, ready for battle just moments ago, was now trapped in a prison of ice that engulfed the area. Silid's voice echoed across the frozen street as he belittled Jinwoo's efforts, dismissing his soldiers as nothing more than small fries. He found it laughable that Jinwoo thought mere summons could stand in the way of the monarchs. To him, the idea that a human had truly absorbed the full power of the Shadow Monarch was nothing but a joke. From a distance, Koresha made a light-hearted, mocking remark. She lamented the fate of her insect children, now frozen solid, as if seeing them again after so long stirred some twisted nostalgia. Jinwoo stood still, hand clenched around Kamish's wrath, as the monarch's mocking voices echoed around him. They made it clear that while the Shadow Monarch had once been the strongest among them, they would not allow their power to be underestimated again. Yet despite the frozen battlefield and the overwhelming might of his enemies, Jinwoo's rage burned even hotter. With a defiant growl, he shattered the ice around his dagger, locked eyes with the Frost Monarch, and pointed his blade toward him. His voice was cold and resolute as he vowed to kill Silid, no matter what it took. The Frost Monarch grimaced, furious at Jinwoo's audacity. With a flick of his hand, he summoned monstrous golems from the frozen earth. Towering figures of ice and stone rose, prepared to crush everything in their path. Meanwhile, the Plague Monarch joined the fray, reanimating corpses from the battlefield into grotesque, spider-like abominations. But Jinwoo struck first. As the creatures swarmed toward him, he moved like a blur, twin daggers cutting through the air with precision. One by one, he shredded the human spiders that leapt at him. Then, a massive ice golem charged and brought down its colossal foot. The impact swept everything in its radius, but Jinwoo judged the timing perfectly. He flashed past the attack and sliced the golem's head in two. Two more golems lunged, claws ready to tear him apart, but Jinwoo was faster. With ruthless speed, he pierced them both, shattering them into icy debris. Without pause, he launched himself like a missile toward the Frost Monarch. Silid barely had time to react. In a blink, Jinwoo appeared in front of him, daggers raised for the kill. But just as Kamish's wrath was about to strike, Hae-In intervened, slashing from behind with his claws. But Jinwoo slipped past the attack, and moments later, a sharp echo rang across the battlefield as his daggers clashed with Hae-In's steely claws. Hae-In smirked, mocking Jinwoo. He was convinced no blade could harm him, but Kamish's wrath was no ordinary weapon. It sliced clean through Hae-In's wrist, severing it completely. Blood sprayed across the ground as the Beast Monarch howled in disbelief. Jinwoo had no time to revel in the blow. A new threat emerged. Koresha appeared midair, hurling a hand imbued with mana at him. Jinwoo barely dodged the magical strike. At the same time, Hae-In calmly began reattaching his severed wrist. Jinwoo exhaled sharply, realizing the battle was far from over. All three monarchs, the Frost Monarch with his golems, the Plague Monarch with her twisted creations, and the Beast Monarch, fully regenerated, advanced in perfect synchronization. Just as the situation turned grim, a sharp crack of ice echoed behind him. Jinwoo turned to see a familiar figure letting out a piercing screech. Baru, his powerful ant commander, had broken free from the ice prison. His instinct to protect his king overwhelmed every other impulse. With a cry that echoed through the street, Baru burst forth. The Frost Monarch stood in disbelief, stunned that one of Jinwoo's shadow soldiers had shattered his binding spell. He was awestruck, realizing that a commander-level entity like Baru was under the control of a human. Even the Beast Monarch faltered for a moment. He recognized the might of a shadow commander, and Baru, in his eyes, was nothing short of a god of destruction. But the Queen of Insects was unfazed. With disdain, she called Baru a disobedient child, intent on punishing him. She extended her hand to crush him midair, but Baru didn't flinch. Enraged, He darted forward and shredded her mana-infused hand with ease. The Plague Monarch reeled back in shock. With Carisha momentarily subdued, Beru returned to Jinwoo's side. He landed beside him, kneeling with reverence, his words filled with admiration for his king's strength. But there was no time for pride. The dead moved once again, more twisted corpses racing toward them. Jinwoo and Beru shifted into attack mode. They tore through the oncoming threats, but in the chaos, Carisha struck. Her attack pierced through Beru. Jinwoo turned to help, but another massive shadow loomed overhead, a colossal palm crashing down on him. The blow hurled him into a building, dust and rubble clouding the air. Dazed by the impact, Jinwoo struggled to rise, but before he could regain full awareness, his gaze lifted to see a hail of ice arrows cascading toward him. Thousands of them, sharp and deadly, rained down like spears from the sky. Yet Jinwoo didn't flinch. He stood his ground, deflecting each one with flawless precision. The Frost Monarch, watching from atop an icy spire, couldn't help but feel a flicker of admiration. Still, with a smug grin, he taunted Jinwoo, questioning how long he could endure an onslaught coming from every direction. Before Scyld could finish his taunt, a dagger shot through his chest. He gasped, eyes widening in disbelief as he looked down at the blade. When his gaze shifted upward, he found Jinwoo standing before him, cold and unwavering. In a voice as sharp as the dagger lodged in his body, Jinwoo reminded Scyld that he wouldn't leave this battlefield alive, and he fully intended to keep that promise. Scyld's blood surged with fury. That a mere human had landed such a blow on a monarch. It was an insult. Jinwoo, watching the creature's face twist in anger, realized something crucial. Piercing the heart wasn't enough. Not for a monarch. He needed to do much more. Without a moment's hesitation, Jinwoo flipped Kamish's wrath into a reverse grip and lunged forward. His movements blurred as he unleashed a brutal flurry of slashes, tearing through ice and air alike in an attempt to overwhelm the Frost Monarch's defenses, but Scyld, instead of faltering under the storm of attacks, let out a slow, confident smile because he wasn't alone. Behind Jinwoo, the Beast Monarch had already moved. Silent as a shadow, he summoned his weapon with a low growl and in one fluid motion brought it down across Jinwoo's back. The blade tore through him with savage force, and Jinwoo's body buckled as blood sprayed from his mouth. From a distance, Beru let out a piercing scream as he watched his king struck so viciously, but his cry of anguish was silenced as the Queen of Insects loomed over him. With twisted pride, she introduced herself as the mother of all insects before grabbing Beru by the torso. Beru thrashed violently in her grasp, roaring in fury. Yet no matter how hard he struggled, he couldn't break free. The crushing weight of her mana held him tight. He couldn't reach Jinwoo, not like this. Jinwoo dropped to his knees, breath ragged, trying to steady himself after the brutal hit. The Beast Monarch raised his weapon once more, preparing to deliver the finishing blow. And in that moment, Beru's rage boiled over. His voice rang across the battlefield as he screamed his king's name, calling upon the other shadows to come forth and defend their lord. Suddenly, the ice across the ground began to fracture, deep cracks webbing outward in every direction. Then, two glowing red eyes pierced through the darkness beneath. Greed was the first to shatter the ice, his massive form bursting forth in answer to Beru's desperate cry. One after another, the higher-ranking shadows broke free. Igris, with his flaming blade, Iron stomping forward with his massive shield, and Tusk already preparing his magic. Their roars thundered across the battlefield as they rallied, driven by one purpose: to destroy anything that dared threaten their king. From a distance, Scyld and Raken watched the growing storm. The monarchs could feel the tide shifting, but neither dared retreat. Not yet. Scyld looked down at Jinwoo, noting the deep wounds and blood staining his hunter gear. The human was falling apart. The end was in sight, or so he believed. Jinwoo slowly looked up, a faint smirk tugging at the corners of his lips. And then, in a calm voice that sent a chill through the air, he activated status effect recovery. As if time bent to his will, the wounds on his body began to heal, slowly at first, then faster, closing with each passing second. The monarchs stared, wide-eyed and stunned, as the man they believed to be on the verge of death began to rise again, body steady, breath even, and eyes burning with renewed fire. The disaster unfolding in Seoul had captured the world's attention. Across the globe, people stopped in their tracks, eyes glued to live broadcasts as Sung Jinwoo stood alone against three monarchs. Back in Korea, Leonard was among the few who could keep up with the chaos unfolding. Standing nearby, he watched in stunned silence as a violent storm of power surged across the battlefield. Beside him, Thomas Andre, still gravely wounded and surrounded by healers, asked what was happening. But even Leonard struggled to form an answer. The scene before him didn't feel like a battle. It felt like the end of the world. From another vantage point, Beck watched too, his eyes wide with awe. He'd always known Jinwoo possessed frightening potential, but this was something else entirely. The sheer pressure rolling off Jinwoo's presence was unlike anything he had ever experienced. Then, the battlefield erupted once more. Igris and Iron charged the Beast Monarch with full force, their combined assault shaking the very ground. At the same time, Tusk and Greed coordinated a pincer strike against the Frost Monarch, launching simultaneous attacks from both flanks. Beru, meanwhile, had just broken free from Kurosha's grotesque grasp by slicing through her twisted fingers. Enraged, the Plague Monarch lunged at him, her form a blur of venom and fury, but she failed to notice Jinwoo, who was already behind her, daggers drawn, his eyes gleaming with quiet rage. Jinwoo's mind flickered back to the architect's prophecy that he would die by a pillar of flame holding up the world. But nowhere had it said the pillar couldn't fall. With that thought, he slashed downward. His daggers cut clean through Koresha's body, drawing a scream of agony from the monarch as he landed beside her, blades dripping. But even before he could catch his breath, her body began to reform, grotesque limbs and torn flesh twisting back together, regenerating at an unnatural speed. Furious now, she unleashed a wave of poisonous energy, filling the air with a noxious miasma that choked the battlefield. Yet Jinwoo stood unmoved. He knew this poison held no sway over him. The system had already detoxified every trace of her attack. Kureisha shrieked, her rage boiling over, her form twisted once more, transforming into a monstrous insect, towering and wild, razor-sharp mandibles snapping as she lunged toward him. But midway through her charge, her body stopped cold, suspended in midair. Jinwoo had silently activated Ruler's authority. The Plague Monarch trembled in place, her limbs paralyzed against the invisible pressure. Jinwoo narrowed his eyes and, without a word, drove her back with a powerful strike, then activated mutilation. His movements turned into a deadly blur, each slash powered by Kamish's wrath, his blade glowing with dark, destructive energy. Kureisha could do nothing but watch in horror as Jinwoo's blade tore through her over and over again, carving her apart with cold, efficient precision. Her grotesque form shattered beneath his onslaught. Jinwoo passed through her crumbling body, stopping only once he reached the other side, his aura pulsing with pure, unmatched power. Behind him, the Plague Monarch's twisted body began to fall apart, piece by piece, eaten away by the force of Jinwoo's strikes. And in her final seconds, she felt it, the pull of something vast and eternal, an all-consuming darkness. With her last breath, she stared in awe at the brilliance of the force before her. A notification flickered into view, confirming the defeat of Kureisha, the Plague Monarch. Moments later, a cascade of alerts followed. Jinwoo had leveled up. Far from the subjugation site, an elite assassin from the Fiend Guild observed Seoul burning under the flames of destruction. He had been standing by for some time now, awaiting a signal to launch support fire. That was his role, a sniper waiting for the perfect shot. But after seeing a world-class hunter like Thomas Andre go down, doubt crept in. Were their chances ever real to begin with? As he stood lost in thought, a cold grip suddenly clutched his shoulder, yanking him back to reality. His heart pounded as a low, bone-chilling whisper crept up behind him, telling him to just sit back and watch. Instinct took over. He spun around, drawing an arrow in a flash, but there was no one there, just empty space. Back on the battlefield, the tide was shifting. The collapse of the plague monarch sent ripples of panic through the enemy. Sillid, watching from a distance, trembled in disbelief. Couldn't fathom how Jinwoo wielded the Shadow Monarch's power with such devastating efficiency. That power, once feared across the cosmos, was now rising again through a human host. But the Beast Monarch dismissed the Frost Monarch's fears. He scoffed, claiming Jinwoo was merely hanging on. Clutching Beru by the neck, Hae-In sneered, mocking Jinwoo's reliance on his summons as he spat that an incomplete monarch could never stand against them. Beru let out a pained screech as his form flickered, his life force draining rapidly. Jinwoo's heart raced at the sight, panic surging as he attempted to recall Beru, but the system denied his command. The message was cold, irrevocable. Jinwoo's fury exploded. In an instant, he lunged at Hae-In and struck him with a devastating blow, sending the Beast Monarch hurtling away and breaking Beru free from his grip. Beru dropped, barely clinging to existence, but alive. The weight of battle bore down on Jinwoo, but there was no time to recover. Sillid, stirred by Hae-In's earlier words, began transforming. His body swelled as an icy glacier spiraled toward the sky. Ice smoke curled from his mouth as he spoke with cold disdain, warning Jinwoo that he was placing too much faith in his power that still lacked an owner. His transformation complete, Sillid unsheathed a trident pulsing with otherworldly energy. He raised the weapon, his voice like frost, as he declared that he would trap Jinwoo's shadow army in a vicious cycle of healing and death, turning them into parasites that would slowly drain him of mana. He lunged forward, trident swinging with a chilling aura. Jinwoo blocked it with his daggers, but the sheer force sliced into his shoulder, blood spraying across the ground. Sillid didn't let up. He spun the trident and slammed it into the earth, shattering the battlefield. But Jinwoo vanished before the blow could connect. Sillid blinked, scanning the terrain. Suddenly, Jinwoo reappeared behind him, daggers aimed for the Frost Monarch's eyes. But Sillid turned just in time, avoiding the strike and countering with a brutal hit to Jinwoo's torso. The impact shattered ribs, blood bursting from Jinwoo's mouth as his body was hurled through the air like a rag doll. Despite the blow, Jinwoo regained his footing. His breath came in ragged gasps, pain burning through every nerve. He had underestimated Sillid's speed. This wasn't the same opponent he had faced before. Sillid advanced, eyes cold and focused. Their weapons clashed in a flurry of strikes, each swing faster, heavier, more lethal than the last. Jinwoo watched every movement, analyzed every breath and shift in mana flow, seeking even the smallest opening. But Sillid didn't flinch. In his mind, this fight was already decided. With weapons now in both hands, the Frost Monarch unleashed a storm of ice. But before the attack could land, Jinwoo had already slipped behind him, eyes locked on his target, thinking he had finally found his moment to strike. But just as he moved, Sillid turned with a smirk. And then, everything froze. Jinwoo's body stopped. His strength drained in an instant. The world turned dark as pain erupted through his chest. Silence fell. Hunters nearby stood in stunned disbelief. Claws, sharp and merciless, had pierced through Jinwoo's back. Blood poured from the wounds, soaking the earth. Behind him, fully transformed into his monstrous werewolf form, stood Raken. The beast monarch grinned as his claws sank deeper. Jinwoo's body trembled, his breath faltered, and as blood spilled from his lips, the realization sank in. He'd been caught, and death was staring him right in the eyes. As his strength began to fade from the loss of blood, the dagger slipped from Jinwoo's grasp, clattering to the ground with a metallic clang. His body was weakening, but his mind struggled to stay focused. This should have been manageable, he thought bitterly. His level had increased. He'd grown stronger. And yet, the brutal reality proved otherwise. The Frost Monarch stepped forward, the air growing colder with each measured step. In his hand, he held one of Jinwoo's daggers, now encased in a cruel sheen of ice. Without hesitation, Scylla drove the frozen blade into Jinwoo's chest, piercing deep. Blood surged from Jinwoo's mouth, the wound gushing crimson as the Frost Monarch sneered, daring him to heal again like he did earlier. Scylla twisted the blade further, mocking that Jinwoo was still incomplete, just a broken imitation of the true Shadow Monarch. As Jinwoo's life force waned, the Frost Monarch continued his vile sermon, painting a grim future for humanity once their army arrived. There would be mountains of corpses, rivers of blood, and for Jinwoo's homeland, an even crueler fate awaited. Scylla vowed to freeze every living being in Korea, imprisoning them in eternal suffering, neither dead nor alive. Jinwoo could do nothing but endure the horrifying vision as ice began crawling through his veins. His limbs went numb, his senses dulled, and his vision faded into darkness. As consciousness slipped away, he sank into an endless void, cold, quiet, and absolute. Then, as if the abyss itself had a voice, a message echoed through the silence. Player HP has reached 0. Another followed instantly, cruel in its finality. The player has died. Everything fell still, the notifications gone, until the screen flickered. The player possesses the Black Heart. A new window emerged from the void, revealing that all requirements for an unknown passive skill had been met. Without delay, the system activated the hidden skill, and its searing light burst through the darkness, engulfing everything. The next instant, Jinwoo's eyes flew open, his body drenched in sweat, chest rising and falling in sharp bursts. He gasped, struggling to steady his breath as scattered thoughts crashed through his mind. Memories of the battlefield and his last moments flooded back in vivid detail. His hand flew to his chest, the sensation of the ice dagger still etched in his nerves, yet he was alive. Just moments ago, he'd been locked in a brutal fight for survival against the Monarchs. Now it all felt distant, like a fading nightmare. Yet one thing was certain to Jinwoo. He was in a hospital. Confusion gnawed at him as he sat up slowly. Then, the door opened and Woo Jinchul stepped in, accompanied by a subordinate. Jinwoo's eyes widened in disbelief, and he asked, breathless, if the chairman had survived the Monarch's assault. Jinchul blinked, taken aback. After a scoff, he corrected him. He wasn't the chairman, just the chief inspector of the surveillance team. He had come to question Jinwoo about the moving statues. Then, with a cautious stare, Jinchul asked how Jinwoo even knew him. This, after all, was their first meeting. Jinwoo's heart pounded. Nothing made sense. Jinchul's words drifted in the background as he explained how the surveillance team and White Tiger Guild had found him unconscious, but Jinwoo wasn't listening. He knew this room. He'd been here before, after the double dungeon. 2 weeks he'd spent recovering in this very bed. The déjà vu was overwhelming. Jinchul remarked offhandedly that Jinwoo looked different from his photo. The words deepened Jinwoo's disconnection from reality. Everything pointed to one terrifying truth. The timeline had shifted, and he was caught between the past and something far more ominous. Trying to maintain composure, Jinwoo excused himself. He needed time to think. He dressed quickly, the confusion still clouding his mind. But even amidst the chaos in his thoughts, one thing was undeniable. His stats remained. So did Kamish's wrath. Somehow he had returned to the past, with everything. Before he could process it, the door burst open. Jinna, his sister, stood there staring at him. She looked shocked, as if seeing a stranger in her brother's place. She stammered, asking if he was really Jinwoo. He seemed different. Jinwoo brushed aside her concern. He told her he had to leave, urgently, and that he was going to the Hunter Association to resign. Jinna's eyes widened at the sudden declaration. That wasn't something she ever expected to hear. Then Jinwoo glanced toward the quiet figure behind her, Han Song-yi. Without pause, he told her not to abandon her studies to become a hunter. Song-yi blinked in disbelief, clearly shaken. She asked how he knew her name. They'd never met before. But Jinwoo had already turned away, his thoughts elsewhere. The shadows were gone, but he would rebuild them. What mattered now was understanding how and why this reset had happened. Arriving at the Hunter Association, he submitted himself for re-evaluation. The device meant to measure his magic power had failed completely to register a reading. They were awestruck, but Jinwoo didn't care. He already knew what they were whispering and had no interest in proving himself again. What he wanted was a meeting with the chairman. The employee hesitated before offering to guide him, but Jinwoo declined, stating he already knew where the office was. As he walked through the familiar halls, the employee stood frozen, puzzled. How could an outsider like Jinwoo know the layout so well? At last, Jinwoo finally reached President Go's office. As he stepped inside, his expression shifted slightly, a subtle trace of something old and familiar passing through his eyes. It had been a long time since he last stood before the chairman. President Go greeted him with a light chuckle, noting how Jinwoo seemed to know his way around already, heading straight to him after receiving his test results. The chairman's tone was direct, ready to address formalities and paperwork, but Jinwoo's mind was elsewhere. Just as the conversation began, a translucent message blinked into view, asking if he wanted to restart the world. But Jinwoo dismissed it, pushing it to the edge of his consciousness for now. There were more important things to handle first. As President Go began speaking, Jinwoo cut in with a proposal. It wasn't a request. It was a deal. He wanted the association to change its regulations to officially recognize summoned creatures as raid participants. In return, he would eliminate the Jeju Island ants once and for all. The chairman blinked, momentarily thrown off by the absurdity of it. He reminded Jinwoo that countless attempts had already failed, that Jeju Island had become a graveyard for even the strongest hunters. But before he could continue, his words faltered as something shifted in the room. Dark energy began to surge around Jinwoo, rising like smoke, yet heavier than gravity itself. President Go froze. His breath caught in his throat as he felt the sheer magnitude of Jinwoo's presence. It was too vast, too foreign, the kind of power that didn't belong to the world he knew. Jinwoo, completely calm as the pressure mounted, met the chairman's gaze and said without pride or hesitation that this was something only he could accomplish. But President Go wasn't listening anymore. His thoughts were spinning, struggling to process the unnatural force before him. And then, just as suddenly, Jinwoo's vision blurred with a rush of memories. The cycle had begun again, dragging his thoughts through the timeline like a torrent. He remembered the Dungeon of Wizards, where Dong-suk and his team had tried to betray him and died for it. Then Kang Pei-shik, the assassin in disguise, whose blade never reached its mark. He saw himself trapped once more in the Red Gate, where he faced the white-furred beast that would later become Tank. Then the Hunters Guild raid, where high orcs had fallen one by one and Tusk had knelt in submission. The notifications for restarting the world kept flashing endlessly, forcing Jinwoo to endure the relentless repetition like a torment with no escape. He saw Demon Castle again, where he'd claimed the flames and brought his mother back from her eternal sleep. He saw Jeju Island and Beru's first kneel, the battlefield soaked in ant blood. But it didn't stop. Over and over, the system pounded him with the same message, forcing him through the same story, the same rise, the same outcomes. It was endless, and it wasn't real. Frustration boiled over as Jinwoo shouted into the emptiness, rejecting the illusion. Something was doing this to him, something external, watching, laughing. A wave of power surged outward as a shadowy domain erupted beneath his feet, swallowing everything it touched. The system bombarded Jinwoo with notification after notification, the words flashing violently across his vision, each one asking the same question, whether he would like to restart the world. Then he felt it, a presence. Something was approaching, drawing closer through the veil of shadows. Jinwoo turned. From the heart of the devouring darkness, a lone figure emerged. Its silhouette was sharp and deliberate, cutting through the black fog like a blade. Clad in gleaming, intricately etched black armor, the figure strode forward with the quiet authority of one who belonged here, like death incarnate wearing a crown. A deep, resonant voice echoed through the void as the figure that emerged offered Jinwoo a tempting proposition: to remain in this world forever, wrapped in the comfort of an endless dream. But Jinwoo's instincts flared. This world was too perfect, too still. He saw through the illusion, his sharp gaze cutting into the shadows. This was a lie, a carefully crafted trap. He met the figure's gaze and asked coldly what the true purpose behind the offer was. But the figure's response was cold and measured as he told Jinwoo he hadn't created this fabricated world. In fact, it was Jinwoo himself who had shaped this illusion. The words sank in slowly, and Jinwoo's heart skipped a beat. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. Yet the figure continued, his form shifting through different human exteriors as he stepped closer, explaining that this world was born from Jinwoo's deepest desires, the need to fix the past, to erase his mistakes. That longing, combined with his own power, had birthed this place, a territory of death, a realm of eternal rest where no escape existed. Jinwoo stood frozen as the weight of it all pressed down on him. The figure explained that Jinwoo had resisted death time and time again, danced on the edge of mortality with every fiber of his being, but death had always been there, watching, waiting. The figure's presence weighed heavier with each passing second as he revealed he wasn't just a bystander. He was a part of Jinwoo, the embodiment of all he had fought against, and a mirror of his deepest struggles. His voice echoed low and steady as he declared himself death itself, eternal rest, endless terror, and the shadow of Jinwoo's soul. This territory, he explained, was under Jinwoo's control. Within it, he could do anything. Creation, destruction, manipulation, all of it was his to command. The figure claimed the power Jinwoo held was identical to his own, and that made them kindred spirits in this eternal game. He had been watching for what felt like forever, waiting for their meeting, knowing it was inevitable. Finally, figure revealed himself as the Shadow Monarch, the king of death, ruler of the deepest reaches of the void. Jinwoo, still reeling from the revelations, demanded in a steady but shaken voice why he had been chosen. The Shadow Monarch's voice echoed once more, steady and vast, as he promised to show Jinwoo everything, the beginning, the end, and the truth behind his very existence. Meanwhile, at the battlefield, Jinwoo's body lay frozen, locked inside a prison of ice. The Beast Monarch stood over him, his gaze filled with certainty as he concluded that Jinwoo was dead. From a distance, Thomas Andre felt something shift, his senses telling him that Jinwoo's presence had vanished. Confusion laced his voice as he questioned what had just happened. Leonard, standing nearby, struggled to find words, even though deep down, he knew the truth. Beck's voice trembled with disbelief, the realization sinking in that with Jinwoo gone, who could possibly stand against the overwhelming might of the magical beast? But then, a shift in the air made everything come to a standstill. The Frost Monarch, standing tall and proud after what he believed to be his victory, suddenly sensed a surge of mana emanating from Jinwoo's seemingly lifeless body. His eyes widened in disbelief, unable to comprehend the unfolding events. Raken's expression mirrored the same shock as realization hit him with force. Something was about to happen. Jinwoo's black heart, once still, began to beat rapidly, burning with the power to rebirth itself. Both monarchs knew what this meant. The true Shadow Monarch was on the brink of resurrection, and they couldn't let that happen. The urgency surged through them, and without hesitation, they lunged toward Jinwoo's frozen form, determined to strike him down before their rebirth could take place. But before they could land their blows, the Beast Monarch was met with a crushing strike to the face. The blow sent him reeling, his vision spinning. Stunned, the two monarchs barely had time to react when another powerful strike hit them, sending them crashing to the ground with an earth-shattering impact. The mysterious figure who had intervened landed gracefully. With a swift motion, he unsheathed two gleaming daggers. It was Sung Il-Hwan. Clad in a shimmering golden robe, he stood as an imposing figure between the monarchs and Jinwoo. His voice, low but commanding, echoed through the air as he declared that from this moment forward, no one would lay a hand on his child. Jinwoo, now cut off from reality, stepped into the Shadow Monarch's realm as the tale began, of a world that once knew only light and darkness. In the beginning of another world, there existed only light and darkness. The absolute being, in his infinite power, divided the light to create the emissaries of God and split the darkness to give birth to the 8 monarchs. These two opposing forces were each given a distinct purpose. While the monarchs existed to destroy, the emissaries were created to protect. And so began a never-ending war, a brutal cycle where both sides clashed repeatedly, annihilating each other's armies without end. Among the emissaries, the brightest fragment of brilliant light grew weary. Endless bloodshed had dulled even the divine spark within him, and he sought the audience of the absolute being. With desperation veiled beneath his reverence, he begged for guidance, pleaded for the power to end the war once and for all, to exterminate the monarchs and bring peace. But the absolute being remained silent. He offered no answers, no salvation, as if the lives of his creations held no weight at all. And in that silence, the emissary understood a horrifying truth. The war was not divine will. It was a spectacle, entertainment for the absolute being. The God they had served, praised, and bled for had no desire for peace. Their devotion had meant nothing. They had followed his laws without question, believing obedience would spare them. But death came regardless. The realization shattered their faith, and in that shattering came resolve. They raised their blades, not against the monarchs, but against their own creator. Thus began the rebellion. It wasn't hatred that drove them, but the desire to end a senseless war, a war devoid of meaning, a war that would never end as long as the absolute being sat above them. Now, as the Shadow Monarch stood before Jinwoo, he pointed toward a glowing figure at the forefront of an ancient army, a 6-winged being of divine brilliance. That had been him, long ago, the only emissary who had refused to rebel, the last to raise his weapon in defense of their creator. But his efforts had been in vain. His soldiers were overwhelmed, crushed by the unity of the traitorous emissaries. In his final moments, he believed his story had ended, yet, when he opened his eyes again, it was in the depths of darkness. There, within the abyss, he discovered something hidden inside him, a power implanted by the absolute being, a final failsafe to be awakened should everything go wrong. The divine light that had once marked him was gone. His wings, scorched and ruined, were torn away, and in their place, he forged new armor from the surrounding darkness. Thus was born the Shadow Monarch, no longer an emissary, no longer a servant of light. He became the king of the dead. With his new power and his growing army of the fallen, he returned to the battlefield, but it was already over. The other fragments of brilliant light had slain the absolute being. They had declared themselves the new gods and called themselves rulers. With their new authority, the rulers wielded divine tools left behind by their creator, artifacts imbued with the absolute being's power, and with those tools, they hunted the monarchs. Wegia, the king of giants, was one of the first to fall. Captured and imprisoned by the rulers, his defeat shattered the balance between the two forces. Realizing that survival was no longer possible without unity, the monarchs were forced to accept an alliance with the Shadow Monarch. Together, they prepared to stand against their common enemy. From that moment forward, he no longer fought for the absolute being or as an emissary. He embraced his identity as the Shadow Monarch. With every battle, his army grew, each corpse, each soul feeding the strength of his undead legion. When the war reached its boiling point, the Shadow Monarch forged a pact with the army of destruction, led by the fearsome king of berserk dragons. Their union shook even the monarchs themselves. He had grown too powerful, too unpredictable. Fear turned to treachery. The Monarch of White Flames and the Beast Monarch conspired against him. Their betrayal nearly wiped out his entire army. The strength he had once wielded became the reason for his downfall. While the Beast Monarch fled, abandoning even his own soldiers, Baran, the king of demons, paid for his treachery with his life. In the aftermath, 4 rulers descended from the sky, their presence oppressive yet quiet. He stood ready to face them, even alone, but they did not attack. Instead, they knelt. One of the rulers addressed him not as an enemy, but with reverence, as the greatest fragment of brilliant light. Their words were humble. They asked for forgiveness. They claimed the war no longer held meaning. The fury boiled within him. How dare they speak of peace? The ruler quietly acknowledged that they, too, had once served the absolute being. But the moment those words left his mouth, the Shadow Monarch's fury surged. He seized the ruler by the face, his grip unrelenting. That admission didn't bring understanding. It made the betrayal all the more unforgivable. They had turned their backs on the very being they were created to serve. The ruler's voice, however, was calm. They reminded him that he, more than anyone, knew the burden of rebellion, knew what it meant to be consumed by sorrow and rage. And still, they begged, not for mercy, but for peace. The Shadow Monarch's grip loosened. He gazed upward, and for the first time, he saw them, his old comrades, the army of brilliant light. They saluted him, not with defiance, but allegiance. Overwhelmed, the Shadow Monarch felt helpless. Even with all his power, he couldn't find peace. Revenge had been his anchor. But now the war was losing its meaning. So he made the decision to go into hiding. After sealing the Monarch of White Flames within himself, his plan was simple. Recover his strength first, then strike back against the Beast Monarch's forces when the time was right. But in his absence, the monarchs grew weak and eventually fell, defeated at the hands of the rulers. And when he finally reemerged, the remaining monarchs were already fleeing, escaping into dimensional cracks. Before he could confront them, the Dragon King intervened, forbidding any form of conflict. He understood the need for strength above all else. And so, the Shadow Monarch was welcomed once more into the monarchs' ranks. With their alliance restored, the monarchs began their search for a new world, one where they could rebuild their forces in secret, beyond the reach of the ruler's gaze. And then, they found Earth. Jinwoo stood in silence, his thoughts spiraling. Visions of cities in flames burned in his mind, too vivid to be mere imagination. He had seen this before, back in the Demon Castle. He turned toward the Shadow Monarch, his voice low and tinged with dread, asking if this was a vision of the future. But the Shadow Monarch's reply echoed clearly in his mind. This was not a glimpse of what was to come, but a memory of what had already been, a record of the past. The devastation he was witnessing had already unfolded long ago. The Shadow Monarch explained that the monarchs were born of destruction, their very existence bound to it, while the rulers were created to preserve balance in a world left behind by the absolute being. So, when the rulers finally became aware of the monarchs' movements, they dispatched their armies to Earth. But their response came too late. By then, humanity had already been ravaged. The rulers, furious over their failure to prevent the devastation, knew the consequences of their inaction. The monarchs had once again annihilated a world, and the rulers could not allow this to continue. In their anger and desperation, they turned to a forbidden tool they had sworn never to use, the Cup of Reincarnation. This divine artifact, infused with the power of the absolute being, had the ability to turn back time by 10 years. Desperate to undo the destruction, the rulers sacrificed everything, using their final measure to reverse the damage. But Earth, small, fragile, and devoid of mana, was unprepared for what was coming. The war, no matter who won, would leave only ashes in its wake. Faced with this grim reality, the rulers made a difficult choice. Aware they couldn't save all, they decided to focus on preserving the survival of a few. That was how hunters came to be. Humans, gifted with strength, meant to endure the storm. Mankind's final hope against the collision of monarchs and rulers. Jinwoo found himself deep in thought, the weight of the truth pressing down on him. The demon king he had once thought, a towering foe in his past, had been nothing more than a fragment, an echo of memories left behind by the Shadow Monarch. The chilling reality settled in as Jinwoo murmured to himself that the world had already faced countless annihilations. This cycle of destruction and rebirth, it had repeated endlessly. The Shadow Monarch confirmed it. The higher beings, monarchs and rulers alike, couldn't alter time, not directly. But they had perceived its shifts, observed the subtle changes brought about by the Cup of Reincarnation. The rulers had tried to correct the course, while the monarchs kept shifting their tactics, adapting again and again until the divine artifact could no longer be used. That revelation unsettled Jinwoo even more. If even the powers that governed reality had limits, then what hope was there for anything else to endure? The Shadow Monarch explained that no power was truly infinite. Even the Cup of Reincarnation, despite its ability to rewind time, had its limits. Just like the absolute being, once mighty enough to shape entire worlds, yet still overthrown by his own creations. Jinwoo's voice was low, almost hesitant, as he questioned how creations could defeat the one who made them. The Shadow Monarch replied that it wasn't so different from humans falling to the machines they'd built. The monarchs had evolved beyond servitude. They began devising their own strategies, even borrowing from the rulers' playbook. Just as the rulers had empowered humans to rise against the magical beasts, the monarchs had planned to descend using human vessels. Through those bodies, they would infiltrate Earth and unleash their armies far earlier than the rulers had anticipated. Their plan was bold: transform the very magic energy meant to save the world into a trap, one that would doom the rulers' forces the moment they arrived. The pieces fell into place in Jinwoo's mind. The monarchs weren't here to conquer slowly. They wanted a massacre, a decisive ambush. And to make that happen, they needed hosts strong enough to bear their essence. However, both the Shadow Monarch and the Monarch of Destruction wielded power far beyond what any ordinary human could endure. Finding a suitable vessel was no easy task. It was a burden few could ever hope to carry. That was when the architect had stepped forward. The most brilliant mage under one of the kings had come with a proposition. He would help the Shadow Monarch find a host in exchange for an imperishable body. But the Shadow Monarch's power was rooted in death. No living being could house it. Still, the architect was undeterred. He crafted a system to seek out a human who could endure the overwhelming force. It was a monumental task. Years passed. Countless failed. And then the system found Jinwoo. He had always been weak, constantly teetering on the edge of death. Yet somehow he had defied it every single time. So, despite the architect's objections, the Shadow Monarch made his decision and chose Jinwoo as his vessel. He told Jinwoo that he was the living record of his struggles, the proof of his defiance, and the reward born from all his suffering. Jinwoo's thoughts spiraled as he tried to make sense of it all. Despite passing every test, he had still believed he wasn't strong enough. The Shadow Monarch corrected him. He hadn't been, not at first. That's why the architect created the system, to gradually reshape Jinwoo, using the player framework to steadily condition him for the overwhelming power he was destined to inherit. And yet, even with this understanding, Jinwoo couldn't let go of one question. Why had the monarch betrayed the architect? The Shadow Monarch hesitated, his expression clouded for the first time. He finally broke his silence, each word carrying the weight of countless years. He spoke of the ruler's apology, the betrayal of the monarchs, and the endless days he had spent watching Jinwoo from afar. He pondered long and hard on where he truly belonged, and the more he watched Jinwoo, the stronger his desire to remain grew. Ultimately, he made his decision, a choice he embraced with clarity. He didn't want to lose Jinwoo. For him, it ran deeper than duty or fate. He had become Jinwoo, and Jinwoo had become him. Their bond had grown inseparable. It no longer mattered who the original owner of the body was. They were now one and the same. And with that understanding, the Shadow Monarch extended a final offer, a choice laid bare before Jinwoo. The Shadow Monarch proposed that Jinwoo could remain here, within the realm of death, embraced by eternal dreams shaped to bring him peace. He could finally rest, or he could return to reality. Return to a world still teeming with enemies, where the struggle never ceased and the fight continued without end. Jinwoo stared at the army of destruction led by the Dragon Emperor, his face set in stone. Then, with quiet intensity, he asked the question that had been lingering in his mind. Why had the Shadow Monarch, who once chose not to fight, fled to another world with the monarchs instead of siding with the rulers? The Shadow Monarch's answer was calm, almost resigned. That world had no place for him. It was never where he belonged. Jinwoo made his choice without hesitation, echoing the monarch's own sentiment. This was not where he belonged either. The Shadow Monarch's gaze softened, a quiet contentment settling over him as he accepted the finality of it all. After countless trials, he could finally rest. With calm certainty, he explained that Jinwoo's power was now whole, and his soul immortal. Through this symbolic death, Jinwoo had been fully reborn as the new Shadow Monarch. They stood in silence, at the edge of parting. The monarch began to speak again, ready to guide Jinwoo back to the real world, but Jinwoo stopped him with a quiet smile, a subtle nod accompanying his words as he assured the monarch that he already knew the path. The monarch, now fully in his original form, looked upon Jinwoo one last time. There was pride in his gaze, fulfillment. After all his wandering, he had found his place. With that final moment, he stepped back, fading slowly into the darkness. Jinwoo looked up at the crimson-tinged sky. A storm brewed in the distance. His enemies awaited, and with a voice clear and unwavering, he spoke the word that would seal his rebirth as the one true Shadow Monarch. Arise. A cascade of notifications followed. The system began to unravel. The first message appeared with a chime that echoed through Jinwoo's consciousness. The deletion code for the player nurturing system had been entered. The very framework that had governed his growth, battles, and ascension was now reaching its end. As the process began, another prompt appeared, revealing that all restrictions on Jinwoo's power had been lifted. No longer bound by artificial limits, all commander-ranked shadow soldiers, including Beru and Igris, reclaimed their full potential. Another message confirmed what he already sensed deep within. The previous Shadow Monarch, Ashborn, had returned to the world of eternal void. Then came the final message, asking Jinwoo whether he would like to delete the system. Without a hint of hesitation, He made his choice and pressed yes. The moment his finger confirmed the decision, the air trembled. Reality itself seemed to fracture as dimensional boundaries crackled and collapsed. The ascension of a new Shadow Monarch had begun. A violent gust of wind tore across the battlefield, followed by a burst of blinding light that threw both the Beast Monarch and Frost Monarch back. The pressure was suffocating. Disoriented, the Frost Monarch erupted with fury, his voice laced with venom as he snarled that Il-Hwan were shielding the disaster that would bring ruin upon the world. It infuriated him that a fragment of light was now standing in the way, aiding the rebirth of the Shadow Monarch. Realizing the urgency, the Beast Monarch's instincts screamed. They didn't have much time left. With no other choice, the two monarchs braced themselves for an all-out onslaught before Jinwoo's transformation could fully complete. Il-Hwan, undaunted by their rage, took a reverse grip on his daggers and planted his feet firmly. There was no fear in his stance, only resolve. The monarch struck without warning, dashing from opposite directions. Speed and power surged through every movement, but Il-Hwan met them head-on. With each clash, his daggers deflected Raken's wild flashes and Silid's thrusting trident. He responded with pinpoint counterattacks, striking with the calm and precision of a warrior who had lived through 1,000 battles. Frustration flickered in Silid's cold eyes. This wasn't just evasion. Il-Hwan was reading them, predicting their movements with near supernatural clarity. Slipping behind Il-Hwan, the Frost Monarch prepared to unleash a gust of bone-chilling wind to paralyze his target, but Il-Hwan sensed it. In one fluid motion, he pivoted and launched a brutal kick directly under Silid's chin. The Frost Monarch was lifted off his feet and sent crashing through a nearby building. Raken, seeing his opportunity while Il-Hwan's attention was diverted, lunged with his massive jaws spread wide, ready to devour him whole. But Il-Hwan reacted in a flash. His dagger shot upward and lodged deep between the Beast Monarch's fangs. Raken let out a thunderous cry, staggering from the sudden agony, and before he could recover, Il-Hwan drove a savage punch into his ribs, sending him skidding across the rubble. Clutching his injured mouth, Raken seethed. He ripped the dagger free and growled through clenched teeth that he would tear Il-Hwan apart, but the words froze in his throat. Something shifted. A dread-soaked sensation crawled over his skin. He turned toward the source, and his blood ran cold. Beyond the fading shimmer of ice, Jinwoo's eyes glowed with a fierce, inhuman light. Terror gripped the Beast Monarch's chest as he immediately leapt back, his instincts screaming louder than reason. He knew. He felt it. The Shadow Monarch was returning. By then, Silid had pulled himself from the wreckage, his face twisted with rage and disbelief as he called for Raken to regroup, signaling for another joint assault on Il-Hwan. But Raken didn't move. The refusal stunned the Frost Monarch. After everything they'd endured, after how far they'd come, Raken was backing away. Silid's voice cracked with disbelief, demanding to know what he was doing. But the Beast Monarch could no longer ignore the truth. The very air around them felt suffocating, thick with mana that pressed down like a storm. The surge radiating from Jinwoo's body was unmistakable. He muttered that the Shadow Monarch was coming, and he wanted no part in it. Silid reminded him of the vow they made to defeat him together. But Raken snapped, saying the promise only applied when the Shadow Monarch was still human. Still trying to sway him, the Frost Monarch spat that he was the king of beasts, that he couldn't turn his back now. But the Beast Monarch simply shook his head, warning the Frost Monarch that he wouldn't understand. He had never faced the full might of the Shadow Monarch. With that, Raken wasted no more words and stepped through the portal he summoned, abandoning the battlefield without a second glance. The Frost Monarch was seething. Rage twisted his features as he cursed the Beast Monarch under his breath, venom dripping from every syllable. To abandon him now, at the peak of battle, was unforgivable. Grinding his teeth until they threatened to crack, Scyld let his fury take over. Slamming his trident into the ground, he summoned a storm born of pure hatred. Snow howled through the streets like wild wolves, wind screaming as cars were hurled like paperweights and buildings buckled under the force. The very air crackled as raw mana fused into dense crystals, forming tens of thousands of jagged icicles. With a furious roar, he sent them all hurtling toward Il-Hwan in a deadly barrage. Despite the sheer magnitude of the attack, Il-Hwan didn't budge. Every muscle tensed as he held his ground, his daggers flashing through the storm, deflecting or shattering as many of the deadly spears as he could. Scyld's hatred twisted further. How could a mere human still stand? How could mortals defy him so openly? Snarling in contempt, he raised his arm high, channeling everything into one final act of annihilation. A massive column of ice, towering, dense, and alive with power, began to form above him, casting a monstrous shadow over the battlefield. This was no longer a spell, it was judgment. He intended to destroy everything in his path, sealing both Il-Hwan and the Shadow Monarch within an eternal frost. Il-Hwan's instinct screamed the moment he saw it. His eyes locked onto the forming ice pillar, and in an instant, he understood what it meant. His body moved, but not fast enough. An ice spear suddenly shot through the chaos, slicing clean through his hand. Blood sprayed as his dagger clattered to the ground, and pain lanced through his arm. He looked up, and for the first time in a long while, felt a chill that wasn't from the cold. The column began to descend. A deafening roar followed, and then, out of the darkness, something surged. A black blur sliced through the sky and collided with the massive ice column, shattering it in midair. Ice exploded in all directions, scattering into fragments like glass beneath a hammer. Beru emerged from the storm with a piercing screech, steam rising from his carapace as he glared toward the Frost Monarch. From the shadows, another figure stepped forth. Igris emerged, his jet-black armor reflecting the glow of falling debris, the crimson mane atop his helm fluttering with the wind. His longsword pulsed with dark energy, stabbed into the ground before him. When he raised his gaze, there was fire in his eyes. The battlefield fell silent as his voice rang out, calm yet searing. He warned the Frost Monarch not to dare belittle their king, not with such pathetic strength. Scyld staggered back in disbelief as his ultimate spell shattered. It wasn't just the surprise of being countered, it was the realization that the tide had turned. He realized with horror that the commander-ranked shadow soldiers had fully regained their strength. And then he felt it. A ripple of pressure spread across the battlefield as the ice encasing Jinwoo cracked. A slow breath escaped from within the cocoon, and then it shattered, pieces falling away like broken glass. Jinwoo stepped forward. He moved with a terrifying calm, shadows curling at his feet like loyal hounds. His expression was unreadable, his voice low as he muttered, almost to himself, that trusting in prophecies was a mistake. Jinwoo's eyes swept over the field. The Beast Monarch was gone. His gaze lingered on the vacant space for a moment, and then he turned his attention to Scyld. Sweat trickled down the Frost Monarch's face as Jinwoo stood amidst the chaos, eyes cold and calculating, asking how anyone dared to leave without his permission. The Frost Monarch, still reeling from the overwhelming presence of the Shadow Monarch, could barely comprehend the immense gap in power between them. To him, Jinwoo felt like an insurmountable wall, an obstacle too great to overcome. The sheer difference in strength left him frozen, not just in body, but in spirit. Jinwoo, however, spared him not even a glance. Ignoring Scyld, he closed his eyes and focused inward, his energy spreading far beyond the battlefield as his perception expanded across vast distances, locked onto one target, the elusive Beast Monarch. A moment later, he opened his eyes. He had found him. That was when Scyld sensed it, a rare opening. Jinwoo had dropped his guard, even if only for a breath. His attention shifted elsewhere, and Scyld knew such a chance might never come again. Clutching his trident, the Frost Monarch poured every ounce of his remaining mana into one final, desperate attack. The ice spear that formed grew impossibly large, crackling with lethal energy, the air around it turning brittle from the sheer cold. Then, in one decisive motion, he hurled it forward, aimed straight at Jinwoo's heart. But Jinwoo remained still, calm as ice. As the spear closed in, he simply raised his hand. Without a word, he invoked Ruler's authority, stopping the trident mid-flight. Then, with a casual twist of his wrist, the weapon distorted violently, its once majestic shape warping into something crooked and broken until it collapsed in on itself and shattered. As the remnants scattered like broken glass, the Frost Monarch stood stunned. In that moment, he saw it, the terrifying truth. Not just the Shadow Monarch's strength, but the overwhelming might of the brilliant fragment that also resided within him. Jinwoo's expression darkened as he shifted his gaze back to the Frost Monarch, his voice like ice as he instructed him to wait patiently. He would deal with him after finishing with the Beast Monarch. Far away, deep within a jungle thick with mist and vines, a portal opened. Raken emerged from it, panting as he stumbled through the trees. He had escaped the battlefield, hoping to vanish into the wild until the King of Dragons returned. But something felt off. His instincts were screaming. That terrible aura of death incarnate was still following him. The shadows of the trees began to shift unnaturally, stretching and writhing like living things. That's when Raken felt it. His breath caught. Fear wrapped around his spine like a chain. He turned, but it was already too late. From the darkened earth, Jinwoo rose. The Beast Monarch staggered back as Jinwoo materialized beside him, his mere presence suffocating. Death radiated from the Shadow Monarch in waves. Raken's instincts screamed at him to submit. There was no escaping this. The gap between them was too wide. Even fleeing was futile. Then, the primal urge kicked in. Survive. With a growl laced with desperation, the Beast Monarch collapsed onto the ground, lowering his body and head as far as he could. His voice trembled as he pleaded, begging for forgiveness, swearing fealty to Jinwoo, and promising that when the time came, he and his beast would rise in support for the great war against the Dragon King. Jinwoo stood silently, his gaze unreadable as he looked down on the groveling monarch. A flicker of a sly grin tugged at Raken's lips. He believed he had fooled Jinwoo. In his mind, the true Shadow Monarch would never make the mistake of forgiving a traitor. Raken planned to play the role of the obedient hound, biding his time until the Dragon King returned. And when that day came, he would tear Jinwoo apart with his own claws. Jinwoo spoke again, his voice cold and unwavering. There could be no alliance, he said, not until a certain debt was paid. Raising his arm, Jinwoo revealed 5 deep scars carved into his skin, marks left by Raken's claws. He weighed down a condition. If the Beast Monarch could withstand 5 of his strikes, he would earn forgiveness. Realization hit Raken like a freezing wave. Jinwoo had never intended to let him live. His body surged with fear and fury as he roared and transformed, shedding his humanoid form. His true shape erupted forth, a massive, towering wolf, fur bristling with mana, muscles rippling beneath thick skin. The jungle trembled beneath his weight. Raken's eyes blazed with fury as he bared his fangs, his voice a guttural snarl as he declared that if he was going to die here, he would make damn sure Jinwoo wouldn't leave unscathed. Jinwoo didn't flinch. Drawing Kamish's wrath, he vanished in a blur, moving faster than the eye could follow. The next instant, the trees behind Raken were cleaved cleanly apart, and blood sprayed high into the air as one of the Beast Monarch's colossal limbs was severed from his body, torn away, before he even felt the pain. Jinwoo stared down at the wounded Beast Monarch, his voice cold as he reminded him There were still 4 more attacks left. Back in Seoul, the city shook as the remnants of the battle raged on. The Frost Monarch had no time to rest. Igris, the Knight of Death, pursued him relentlessly, his demon monarch sword crackling with raw whitening energy as it hummed through the air. Beru was still tending to Thomas Andre's battered form, but Igris had no need for backup. Scyld ran through the ruins, panic etched on his face. He knew what Igris had become after unlocking his full potential. There was no stopping the knight now, not with his mana nearly depleted. Weeping to a rooftop, Scyld tried to regain his composure. Sneering down at the Shadow Knight, he mocked him in a desperate attempt to mask his fear, claiming that holding out against him would be futile. But Igris didn't respond. He stopped mid-fight, lowered his sword, and raised his cape with reverence, as if saluting a king. From the black mist of Igris's shadow, Jinwoo emerged. Scyld's blood ran cold. His gaze dropped to the ground where, resting at Jinwoo's feet, lay a familiar set of fangs, unmistakably torn from Raken's maw. Jinwoo's voice cut through the tension as he announced that the Beast Monarch was dead. The Frost Monarch couldn't fathom it. How, in the brief time Jinwoo had vanished, the Beast Monarch had already fallen. His mind raced in disbelief, trying to comprehend the impossible. But Jinwoo stood tall. His voice, calm and absolute, left no room for doubt as he declared that the fall of the Plague Monarch, the Beast Monarch, and soon the Frost Monarch would be a message, one that the rest of the monarchs would never forget. In a panic, Scyld summoned a ring of ice arrows around himself, ready to launch them with everything he had left. But before he could move, a dagger slammed into his shoulder, tearing flesh. Then another hit. Blood sprayed as he staggered, unable to keep his footing. He opened his mouth, gathering one final surge of mana in his throat, aiming to unleash a deadly blast of cold. But Jinwoo was already there. In a flash, he closed the distance, grabbing Scyld's face, clamping a hand over his mouth to trap the energy inside. Then, with his other hand, he slashed a brutal line across the Frost Monarch's chest. As Scyld reeled back, gasping in pain, Jinwoo's eyes gleamed faintly with something between pity and detachment as he remarked that the Beast Monarch had died on the 4th strike, and wondered aloud how many the Frost Monarch would last. Scyld's cry echoed across Seoul as his body began to collapse. The icy armor that once shielded him fell apart in chunks, revealing the fragile, mortal form beneath. Piece by piece, the Frost Monarch disintegrated into dust, carried away on the wind. Jinwoo stood tall beneath the purple sky, unmoving as the last remnants of his enemy vanished into the air. And at long last, the Battle of Monarchs was over. Beru approached Jinwoo, kneeling in unwavering loyalty. Jinwoo acknowledged him with a slight nod, his voice calm as he asked about the individual who had shielded him during the chaos. Beru explained that the man had vanished without a trace. Jinwoo listened silently. Then, something on the ground caught his eye. He turned and walked over, his gaze sharpening as he bent down and picked it up. A dagger, aged and all too familiar. Not far from the battlefield, behind a half-demolished building, Sung Il-Hwan leaned against a crumbling wall. His body, bloodied and torn, trembled as he tried to steady his breathing. Every breath burned in his chest, and he could feel it. The divine power of the rulers eating away at his mortal form. There was no reversing it now. His body had reached its limit. In those fading moments, he reflected on everything. The choices, the silence, the cost. Maybe this was how it was always meant to end. A soft metallic sound reached his ears. He looked down to see a dagger spinning to a stop near his foot. His eyes slowly lifted. His son stood there. Jinwoo's voice broke the silence, quiet and firm, disappointment woven into every word as he finally called him dad again, asking why he had left without saying anything. Sung Il-Hwan began to speak, his voice low and strained as he revealed the truth he'd kept buried for so long. He told Jinwoo how everything had begun when he was trapped inside a dungeon gate, a rift with no exit. There had been no escape, no rescue, only time, a slow, crushing weight bearing down on him as his body began to wither. Death by thirst or starvation had seemed inevitable until the rulers appeared. They had saved him, but not without cost. He hadn't been chosen out of mercy. They had their reasons. They offered him their strength, and in return, they asked him to stop the monarchs, including the Shadow Monarch, who was soon to be born. With no other path left, Il-Hwan accepted. He became their emissary, returning to Earth burdened with a mission that felt heavier than any battlefield. Yet when he witnessed the vessel of the Shadow Monarch firsthand, he faltered, because that vessel was his own son. Even knowing the greatest threat to humanity slumbered within Jinwoo, Il-Hwan couldn't bring himself to follow through. All he could do was watch from a distance, silently, helplessly. In the meantime, the rulers, who had initially focused solely on preventing the Shadow Monarch's full descent, began to shift their stance. Slowly, they came to realize that to stop the monarch's ultimate plan and prevent the world's destruction, they needed the full strength of the Shadow Monarch on their side. Only his army possessed the power to stand against the coming storm, the Dragon King's legions. Eventually, the brightest fragment of brilliant light issued a new order: protect the Shadow Monarch at all costs. It had been a gamble. None of them knew which side Jinwoo would choose when the time came. But now, here in the present, the answer had become clear. And the moment he saw Jinwoo standing against the monarchs, choosing to fight for humanity, there had been no hesitation. Il-Hwan had made his choice too. He'd always followed what he believed was right. He'd made peace with the consequences, no matter how heavy they were. But deep inside, he'd hoped, selfishly, that Jinwoo would never have to see that part of him. His gaze softened as he looked at his son, voice quiet as he asked if Jinwoo had ever hated him. Jinwoo, eyes lowered as rain poured around them, admitted quietly that sometimes he did. He remembered the days he struggled just to survive as a hunter, and in those darkest moments, his thoughts always drifted to the man who had disappeared without a word. He'd hated him for that. Il-Hwan lowered his gaze in silence, the regret carved deep into his face. But then Jinwoo continued, saying that despite that hatred, despite everything, he had always missed him. The words hit Il-Hwan like a blade. Jinwoo then asked, voice barely audible through the rain, whether he had missed them too. Il-Hwan couldn't answer. Emotions surged, suffocating him, breaking down walls he built over the years. And then, quietly, it all unraveled. His hand pressed to his head, tears spilling from his eyes as he broke down and admitted how much he'd missed them all. Even if they hadn't seen him, even if he could only watch from the shadows, he'd been there, and that had been enough to keep him going. He rose unsteadily to his feet and walked toward Jinwoo, arms trembling as he wrapped them around his son. He told him how much he'd grown, how proud he was of who he had become. Jinwoo's eyes welled up, fists clenched in frustration, as he asked if the rulers were the ones behind it all. Il-Hwan shook his head. The rulers hadn't forced him, hadn't bound him in chains. They had given him a choice, and he had chosen to protect his son, no matter the price. He didn't regret it, not any of it. But his body had reached its end. Jinwoo could feel it. He stepped in and pulled his father into one final embrace, holding him tightly. Il-Hwan's voice broke as he whispered his one true regret, that he hadn't been the father he wanted to be. The divine energy that had held his broken body together finally gave way. His form flickered, crumbled, and in an instant, turned to ash. Jinwoo reached out, hand grasping at nothing. The last traces of his father scattered through the air. Grief surged through him like a storm, and with a cry that tore through the heavens, he let out a roar of anguish that echoed across the sky. Rain pounded harder, as if the heavens themselves mourned alongside him. Far away, inside a quiet home, Jinwoo's mother stood at the window, her gaze lost in the downpour. A single tear rolled down her cheek, as if something deep inside her had just broken. Jinwoo sat in silence beside her. She didn't say a word, but she too felt it. The weight in the air, the stillness that only came when something irreplaceable was gone. Jinwoo's voice echoed across the ruined battlefield, laced with fury and raw pain. It wasn't just a cry, it was a declaration, a message hurled into the heavens where the monarchs waited. To those who had targeted Earth, who had slaughtered innocents and taken his father from him, he vowed retribution. They would pay, each and every one. The day his roar shook the skies marked the beginning of war. Above the battlefield, news drones hovered, capturing the aftermath as broadcasts flooded the airwaves. Reports confirmed that Hunter Thomas Andre was no longer in critical condition. Ambulances had already begun transporting the injured to hospitals, weaving through rubble and collapsed buildings. The monstrous creatures, once harbingers of death, had vanished into nothingness, reduced to cold, lifeless ash. After the carnage, Jinwoo returned home. The door barely closed behind him when he was pulled into a tight embrace, his mother and sister clinging to him. Elsewhere, in the stillness of the Hunter Association's headquarters, Chairman Woo Jin-chul sat alone, his eyes fixed on the television screen, replaying footage from earlier. His thoughts drifted back to Jinwoo's oath, the one he'd made before charging into battle, a vow to kill the demonic beast responsible for President Go's death. And he had kept that vow. A heavy breath escaped Jin-chul's chest. Gratitude surged through him, overwhelming and pure. Tears welled up, spilling freely as he quietly thanked Jinwoo from the bottom of his heart. In Seoul, reconstruction efforts began immediately. The city, now a skeleton of its once thriving self, bore the scars of war. But even amid the first signs of recovery, an invisible weight lingered in the air. The monarchs had fallen, but something worse loomed. The true calamity hadn't yet arrived, and its shadow was already creeping across the sky. In the days that followed, tens of thousands of hunters from every corner of the globe gathered beneath the colossal gate hanging above the world like a judgment waiting to descend. The air buzzed with tension. Among them, Mu Zhigang, China's 7-star hunter, stared up in awe. The gate was massive, terrifyingly so. The thought gnawed at him that even this army, countless as it seemed, could vanish into that abyss and never return. Beside him, Thomas Andre stood tall, his gaze unwavering. He could feel it, the pressure, the tremor in the air. The moment was close. Further back in the crowd, Jin-chul scanned the field of hunters. The sheer number of them brought no comfort. He couldn't help but wonder how many would live to see tomorrow. At the front of it all stood Jinwoo, his eyes locked onto the sky above with a grim, unreadable expression. Hae-In stood beside him, close, but not speaking, until finally she murmured that she had never seen him like this before. Jinwoo let out a quiet scoff at her words, but the seriousness in his eyes betrayed the truth. He felt it too. The gate was on the brink, and the moment he'd prepared for had finally arrived. The sky split, cracks spread across the gate's surface like veins of darkness, and then silence shattered. Hunters tensed, weapons readied. Formation lines snapped into place as the black barrier that had separated dimensions vanished completely. Then they came. A flood of magic beasts burst from the gate, so many that they blotted out the sky itself. The air turned thick with their presence, claws, fangs, wings, and shrieks. Over 100,000, swarming like a plague, their numbers vast enough to swallow cities whole. That wraps up the Monarchs War Arc. Stay tuned for the upcoming parts, hit the subscribe button, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next part when it drops. I'll see you in the next one as we dive into a brand new chapter.